Chapter 957. Why do you have to be from the Empire? Sulu took a puff of his cigarette and replied with a smile, Mr. Chief Editor, it doesn't matter if I want to or not. It's not that I want to, but I have to. Everyone can't choose their own birth. Reporter Wood, who was dizzy due to air sickness, added a comment, and you can't choose your own death. That's right. Sulu looked at the two thin reporters, paused for a moment, and suddenly said, about the story between the Empire and the Federation. Can we talk about it in the future? Snowflakes slowly fell on the George Carlin Art Center. When the relevant military police department in charge of enforcing military discipline arrived, Da Vinci, who was sitting in a wheelchair, had already disappeared silently. The people, who were still immersed in sadness and anger, intentionally or unintentionally obstructed the actions of the government. They even knocked the military police around in an extremely provocative manner. It was like an angry sea teasing a lonely fishing boat. Hand over Chief Editor Bob. Hand over Reporter Wood. Disband the Joint Investigation Department. Restart the investigation of the ancient bell. Investigate the conspiracy in the front line. Abolish the Patriot Act. End the world ruled by the secret police. President Pabre, step down. The female speaker with a red face on the stage used exaggerated and professional body language and a hoarse but sincere voice to loudly complain to the lead gray sky. Tens of thousands of angry people under the stage waved their fists and made a loud response. Parades and gatherings had always been an extremely long entertainment activity. Because it was too long, the enthusiasm of the people could easily be worn down by the cold weather and repetition. However, the almost perfect flow control of the silent march command, the excellent emotional stirring of the speakers, and the resolute response of the backbone members prevented this from happening. About 4 hours after the twilight in Spring City faded, the Capital Special District ushered in the light gray evening. Shouts for the release of Bob would still echoed in the venue. From time to time, someone would read the famous special issue aloud. At this moment, an ordinary military vehicle drove to the southeast corner of the venue. Two middle-aged men wearing black trench coats and hats slowly walked to the podium with the help of the staff of the silent military command. The noise in front of the George Carlin Art Center quieted down. The people wearing scarves looked at the stage in confusion, trying to recognize who those people were. The Capitol Police Bureau, which was in charge of maintaining order at the scene, immediately knew the identities of the two middle-aged men because the two thin faces were so clear on their remote camera system. Chief Editor Bob, Reporter Wood, why are they here? The people at the rally recognized the two middle-aged men, too. They turned around and told their companions in shock and excitement. Like the officers of the police headquarters, they had no idea why the two celebrities who had been arrested by the government in the name of the Patriot Act suddenly showed up at the rally. Deafening cheers resounded in front of the Art Center. At the outermost edge of the crowd, the director of the Capital Special Administrative Region Police Bureau looked at a senior official of the Joint Investigation Department, whose expression was even worse, and said angrily, "Are you crazy? You want us to arrest them now? I know they are fugitives, but please open your eyes and take a look. There are tens of thousands of angry people at the scene. If we, the police, dare to walk into the crowd and read the arrest warrant, we may be torn to pieces in the next moment." The director of the General Administration, who was very experienced in dealing with mass incidents, knew very well what the two reporters who were talking about their tragic life in black prison on the podium meant to the Federation government and the president. But he also knew that if he provoked the anger of the people at the rally at this time, things would get even more out of hand. So he refused the other party's order without hesitation. With a gloomy and cold smile, he said, "According to the Patriot Act, only you have the right to arrest these criminals, and in fact, they escape from your hands." The meaning of this sentence was clear. It was the Joint Investigation Department's trick to arrest the other party, and it was the Joint Investigation Department's mistake to let the other party escape and enter the rally. So, it was naturally the responsibility of the Joint Investigation Department to solve this matter. The senior official glared at him fiercely, then turned to look at Reporter Wood, who was speaking on the podium. His fists hanging on both sides of his trench coat couldn't help but tremble slightly. If it were anyone else, they wouldn't have the guts to order the soldiers of the Small-Eyed Special Forces to shoot at tens of thousands of people who were cheering. So he could only watch and wait to be burned to ashes by the anger of the President and Chairman Lee. Repeal the Patriot Act. March to the Supreme Court. Long live the Charter. Long live the Seventh Group. Night slowly fell, and snowflakes fell desperately while the sun was at its dimmest. The temperature dropped a few degrees, but the atmosphere in front of the George Carlin Art Center had become extremely fanatical. The excited people surrounded Chief Editor Bob and Reporter Wood, shouting slogans nonstop. The silent march had reached the final stage of the battle. The good people who were trying to repeal the Patriot Act welcomed two of their most prestigious and most powerful comrades. However, night had already fallen, and marching to the Supreme Court could only be done tomorrow. So, the people, full of fighting enthusiasm and optimism, began to dance and sing in front of the Art Center. They were ready to party all night, and no one was willing to leave to rest, because they knew that only with the bodies of tens of thousands of companions could they protect Bob and Wood in the middle. A bright beam of light suddenly illuminated the podium. The people, who thought that it was the searchlight of the Federation military and police, were in an uproar, which quickly turned into even more fanatical cheers. The national idol Jian Shuer, who hadn't been seen for a long time, appeared in the bright beam of light. Wearing a simple and plain blue uniform, she waved to the tens of thousands of people with a smile and a microphone in her hand. The same battle required different weapons, because the people who participated in the battle were always good at different things. Some people would charge into the dangerous enemy camp with guns, such as the Seventh Group. Some people would frown and keep copying on paper, such as Bob and Wood. Some people seemed to be sitting silently and calmly in the command center, but in fact they were thinking about all the strategies, such as Tai Ziyuan. More ordinary people chose to vote with their feet and express their attitude with their bodies, such as the cheering crowd at the rally. Jian Shuer was no longer an actress, but a singer, so she didn't say too many enthusiastic words of encouragement, nor did she play the role of a goddess who summoned the people to fight. She just sang a song with a very serious attitude. The first line of the song was, "When we discover the truth of life, but still love it as much as we did yesterday, we are heroes." Outside the dense crowd, under an inconspicuous cold-resistant redwood tree, Sulu, wearing a sports windbreaker, slightly raised the brim of the hat on his forehead. Across the sea of thousands of people, he looked at the unforgettable, beautiful face on the stage and smiled slightly. Standing under the tree, he quietly listened to the woman's clear and charming voice, full of tranquility and determination. The feeling in his heart was indescribable, just like last year when he first heard the song written for him. The song gradually faded away. Sulu lowered the brim of his hat again, silently turned around, and walked toward the quiet street that contrasted with the lively crowd. After sending Bob and Wood to Tai Ziyuan, the Seventh Group disbanded and left, divided into 3 groups to carry out their respective tasks. He believed that the thin guy who often coughed definitely had a way to keep Bob and Wood safe, so he left with peace of mind. The cold wind gradually rose in the quiet street, and it was particularly piercing. Now, Sulu naturally didn't have to worry about frostbite or catching a cold. He still subconsciously turned up his collar to cover his neck, then put his hands to his lips and exhaled a mouthful of hot air. There were bright and warm houses in the buildings on both sides of the street, and there was the sound of children playing and the whimpering of cats fighting. There were also dark rooms. He didn't know where the owners of those rooms were now, or if they were in the crowd in front of the George Carlin Art Center. There was an inconspicuous convenience store at the corner in front of him. There was a New Year's festive light hanging on the door. Because it had been hanging there for a while, it was covered with a thick layer of dust and looked a little old. The light in the store was dim. Sulu walked in, brushed past a burly man, took out some change from his pocket, put it on the counter, and said, "I want a blue box 37. The man seemed to have finished buying the goods he needed, turned around, and left. His extremely tall and burly figure made him have to lower his head when he passed by the old lamp. The boss took the change, turned around, and began to look for cigarettes. Su Li's eyes fell on the glass shelf and looked at the burly man walking out of the door with the reflection. He noticed that the moment the man lowered his head, a ferocious tattoo petals appeared on the back of his neck. "Thank you." After taking the cigarette, Su Lu bent down and picked up a heavy black long box at his feet. His movements were extremely casual, as if he had just brought it in himself. He carried the long black box out of the convenience store and disappeared into the night of the capital special district. Inside the long black box was not a violin, not a flute. It was a gun, a big gun. The ferocious tattoo petals on the back of the neck actually extended from the back to the waist. The branches and leaves were deep, and it was only part of a tattoo flower pattern. The burly man with such a terrifying tattoo on his body had an extremely delicate name, Zhang Xiaohua. This big shot of the underworld in South Kaizhou had strength and dignity that could not be underestimated. A character like him, no matter what era or situation he was in, would have his own exclusive country and style. However, since leaving the prison and entering Bermuda and meeting a man of the same age named Lin Banshan, he was willing to become the other's assistant and arm. He was silent and quiet, and only strong and violent when the other needed. In the 75th year of the constitutional era, Lin Banshan took all the elites from Bermuda back to the Federation. He wanted to fight against the government with the strength of the wild, and Zhang Xiaohua did not hesitate to follow. In the capital of South Kaizhou, he had turned his hand over to draw blood. He had fled thousands of miles in a frozen fish cart. He had shot through an armored car outside the forest garden. Tonight, he had given the gun to Su Lu. Chapter 958. There were only 2 ACWs in the entire Federation, one of which accompanied Mr. Sher to shake the Parliament Hill, and the other one was rumored to be in Lin Banshan's hands. Rumors always had their source, so it was true. All these years, the ACW had been waiting in a secluded cellar until it was taken away by Zhang Xiaohua. He knew what kind of terrifying magic the gun had, and what kind of surprise weapon it could play in this war. But when Lin Banshan asked him to give it to Su Lu, a citizen of the Empire, he didn't hesitate. Because Zhang Xiaohua had never doubted Lin Banshan's judgment. Dim and bright lights were cast from the apartment buildings on both sides of the street. The man with the tattoo walked silently in the night and snow. With his steady and fast steps, the height of the buildings on both sides gradually decreased, the scenery became chaotic, and the environment began to become noisy. A night taxi stopped outside the repair shop. The driver inside was covered with a blanket with his eyes closed, as if he was sleeping. No one noticed, but when Zhang Xiaohua's emotionless gaze swept past, the driver nodded slightly in acknowledgement. In front of him, the barbecue stall owner waved a big spoon and stir-fried vegetables. The fat boss lady waved her greasy hands behind her, but gently, as if she was driving away non-existent mosquitoes. Along the streets Zhang Xiaohua passed by, ordinary citizens like this would appear from time to time. They used their hands and eyes to express the unique language of the underworld. Just like that, the burly man wanted by the Federation government safely walked into the only welfare area in the capital special zone, Yellow Wind Village. The so-called welfare area was just another name for the slums. The people here basically didn't have official jobs, had a meager income, and relied on social welfare. They received boring synthetic protein meat on time, received very little subsidies, lived in cheap rental houses provided by the government, and sent their children to schools that the rich disdained. Their lives were very difficult. Just as described in social history books, it was always easy to breed evil in areas where life was difficult. Illegal brothels that were often blocked by condoms in the sewers, underground casinos full of the smell of smoke and sweat, and drug dealers in the shadows of the alleys were the 3 most common sights in this area. Zhang Xiaohua waved her hand and lifted the straw curtain. She walked into a large courtyard expressionlessly. She walked along the corridor at the bottom of the building, avoiding the junk in front of her. Along the way, she passed by many rooms with half-closed doors. Through the gap, He could see that some of the people in the room were watching TV, some were very nervous, and some only had numbness on their faces. There was a child playing a game of sticking a knife into the mud with the gangsters and was extremely excited. There was also a middle-aged man who was locked in solitary confinement, panting and wriggling on top of a prostitute. Zhang Xiaohua seemed to be expressionless and looked straight ahead, but in fact, she had already seen the scenes in all the rooms along the way. In these rooms, other than his most loyal and capable subordinates, there were also a lot of people whose clothes and auras did not match the environment of the Yellow Wind Manor. They were hostages, with food, clothing, and a way to satisfy their physiological needs. The hostages were in a good state of mind. At the very least, they were still far from the edge of insanity. After confirming this, Zhang Xiaohua finally showed a satisfied expression on her face. She slightly nodded to the middle-aged man with a respectful expression at the back door and walked out. A very ordinary car was parked in the snowy night at the back door. Zhang Xiaohua opened the door and sat in the driver's seat. She took a thick cigarette from the side and lit it. She took 2 puffs. Because her body was too burly, her iron lungs made the tip of the cigarette suddenly turn red, and the smoke instantly filled the car. Han Chu, who was sitting in the back, frowned. She pulled out a delicate silk handkerchief and covered her mouth and nose. She began to cough nonstop, and a few bright red spots appeared on her ghostly pale cheeks. I know very well what a huge role an authoritative news media can play in this war. Cough, cough. Han Chu put down the handkerchief and shook her head. She frowned and said, "What I don't understand is how much an effect kidnapping the relatives of the TV station staff can play. What if they call the police?" The incident in South Kazhou proved that this kind of violent method is effective. Zhang Xiaohua gently stroked her smooth head. After a moment of silence, she said, "If the police station is alerted, there will be big trouble. But we have to bet that those directors don't have the courage of Bob and Wood." Han Chu's eyes fell on his empty right hand. Her pupils shrank slightly, and she was as cold as a poisonous snake. She said in a cold voice, "Did you really just give it to that Empire person?" "Yes." Zhang Xiaohua replied with a blank expression. "This is really interesting. That Empire Crown Prince seems to trust us very much. In fact, I have been waiting for him to threaten us with the lives of Li Feirong and the child. But he didn't give me the opportunity to repay him." Han Chu's eyes slightly lowered. Her simple words hid a very strong meaning. Zhang Xiaohua was silent. The car slowly drove away from the ruined street. The half-open window blew out a thick fog of high-grade tobacco from time to time, which seeped into the fluttering snow. Dozens of minutes later, this ordinary-looking car came to an ordinary-looking building complex in the western suburbs of the capital. The dim lights illuminated the slowly falling snow above the building complex. No one could find the heavy firepower around it. The iron gate slowly opened. Zhang Xiaohua and Han Chu's car entered the heavily guarded building complex without any inspection. The flat, beamless houses covered a large area. There were thick wire bundles on the side of the road. There was a faint low hum of the motor. The white smoke discharged from the sewage treatment equipment in the distance proved that this building complex was some kind of factory. The car stopped outside a factory. Zhang Xiaohua and Han Chu walked in and walked along a transparent corridor. There were several fully automatic assembly lines on the other side of the corridor. Countless sophisticated mechanical devices were operating in a near-vacuum environment. They were so thin that the front end was almost invisible to the naked eye. They were retracting like lightning, as if they were doing a micro-engraving work on a substrate on the assembly line. If it was Su Lu walking in the transparent corridor at this time, he would definitely be shocked by everything in front of him. He might even look at the assembly lines in a daze, because such sophisticated micro-level equipment couldn't be found even in the Husk Institute. Zhang Xiaohua and Han Chu didn't have any strange emotions. They walked forward in silence with no expression or pale cheeks. When they first entered the factory, they were shocked. Later, they found that without the brain of a senior engineer, they couldn't understand the equipment, so they could only ignore it. In the office at the end of the transparent corridor, A middle-aged man wearing a green filter suit was looking down at the data in an electronic notebook. Although the filter suit was a bit large and thick, it still couldn't cover the mountain-like shoulders. Lin Banshan, who looked like a senior engineer, raised his head and looked at his two most capable companions. He smiled and said, "It seems that things are going well." After confirming that Chief Editor Bob and Reporter Wood were handed over to the Silent March Command, I followed your instructions and personally handed the gun to him. Zhang Xiaohua replied. Han Chu stood by the side for a long time. When he saw that Lin Banshan was about to look down at the electronic notebook again, he could no longer suppress the anxiety in his heart. He undid the second button of his black suit and frowned. If we are discovered afterwards that we are working with a person from the Empire to deal with the government, and that person is a prince, we will go down in infamy for thousands of years. Go down in infamy for thousands of years. Lin Banshan raised his head and said with a smile, "I don't care about that." As if eavesdropping on these evil and meaningless words that made people feel incomparably free and easy, the wind outside the factory suddenly became more violent. A snowflake that had just stuck to the roof was easily lifted by the whistling cold wind and swept up high. The snowflake spun and rolled higher and higher, then slowly fell again. It floated over the factory that covered an area of 14 square kilometers and landed on the cornerstone by the pine forest at the south gate of the factory. The smooth black stone monument was covered with light snow, as if it was wearing a funny white hat. A line of words was engraved on the stone monument. The 24th benchmark chip production base of the Bureau of Proclamation. After the bloody incident in the capital of South Kizhou, Lin Yuan was divided. The Federation government began to search for Lin Banshan and his subordinates, intending to directly extinguish this dark force. However, who would have thought that the King of Bermuda was hiding in a chip factory of the Bureau of Proclamation? There was no doubt that this was the safest place for Lin Banshan. The snow outside the window stopped. Zhang Xiaoming looked at the 5-person team statue in the snow on Charter Square. There was a faint trace of worry between her eyebrows. There was a knock on the door. Anyone would feel unhappy to be disturbed in the early morning. But Zhang Xiaoming just calmly turned around, tied her somewhat messy hair into a ponytail, and opened the door. This was the heavily guarded Parliament building. She was the highest official of the anti-government army in the capital's special district of Green Dragon Mountain. She was responsible for the deep sea of the 4 departments. The person or news that disturbed her at this time must be very important. Of course, she was so calm now because she woke up very early today. Bob and Wood appeared at the scene of the meeting. According to your instructions, the organization has started a reverse investigation. There are some preliminary results now. The male subordinate, who was publicly identified as a deputy military officer, looked at her nervously and reported. According to the information from the Ministry of Defense, there was an attack at the number 1 military region sanatorium at 20 noon yesterday in the capital time zone, 6 in the evening in Spring City. The attackers should be the first 7 groups of soldiers. Zhang Xiaoming nodded. The subordinate looked at her and said hesitantly, "According to the witness report, it is confirmed that the former Federation Colonel Su Lu appeared at the scene of the attack. Although the story of the first love between the leaf of Green Dragon Mountain and the hero of the Federation was not as well known as the man involved in the National Idol Girls' engagement, it was not a secret. At least, all the fish in the deep sea knew that their young female leader had certain untouchable areas. However, to his surprise, Zhang Xiaoming's expression did not change at all. She just nodded softly. The door closed. She walked into the bathroom and looked at the man in the wheelchair with an unnatural expression. After a moment of silence, she asked in a low voice, "Your name is Da Vinci?" "Did Sulu give you such a crazy idea? Did he say anything else?" Chapter 959. Tai Yuan, the young senator, led tens of thousands of supporters to walk in the open silently. Lin Mid-Mountain, the king of the underworld, hid his blade in the dark. Zhou Yu, the woman of the red flower, built a solid Taoist foundation with the help of her family and possibly even the terrace of Emo Chao's back mountain. Su Lu and Team 7, the Hard Rock, spat out violent gunfire to pave a bloody path. The four of them had their own strengths, and no one could compare to them. They either secretly helped each other or interlocked with each other based on the tacit understanding they had in the past. In today's Federation, they weaved a rigid barbed wire net with countless barbs hanging from it. The seemingly invincible government of the Federation, which had countless resources, looked particularly dim in front of the net. The enormous bureaucracy, which was composed of corrupt, incompetent officials and political opportunists, was extremely inefficient and lacked vigor because of countless rules and scruples. The military, which could easily tear the net into pieces, could not fully demonstrate its fierceness according to the spirit of the Federation's charter. In fact, the Bureau of Proclamation, which had been controlled by the government, was no longer as omnipotent as it had been in the past thousands of years for some strange reasons. Both the charter computers underground and the staff of the Bureau of Proclamation in the hall above ground were now in a strange, torturous situation. Fortunately, the Federation government's control over the news media did not weaken. In fact, it even strengthened. After the bloody incident in the capital of Nank State, the news channel carried out the most profound self-examination. Even the most courageous newspaper, the Capital Special District Daily, became extremely silent because its chief editor and chief reporter were imprisoned. It was exactly because of such strong control that the major media of the Federation adopted the strategy of downplaying or even ignoring the silent march into the Capital Special District and the two speeches that were enough to shake the Federation. The victory documentary of the battle in the Straits on the front line of the Mo Hua planet and the thighs of the stars and the labor parties of various states filled the light screens and pages. This morning, the major media of the Federation were all out in full force, which was extremely rare in the past 3 years. Countless reporters brought interview equipment to the judicial district next to Robbie Avenue. This was because the news that was about to happen made it impossible for the editorial boards of all the newspapers and television stations to ignore it. Furthermore, the parties who were about to go to the Supreme Court to accuse the Patriot Act of being unconstitutional were Chief Editor Bob and Reporter Wood. Tens of thousands of people who had stayed up all night poured into Robbie Avenue, their footsteps stepping on the snow-covered lawn, leaving all kinds of footprints. There is no sleepiness or fatigue on their faces, only excitement and anticipation. Outside the Supreme Court, there were already 3 circles of yellow cordons. The judicial gendarmes vigilantly watched the dense crowd, their expressionless faces hiding the nervousness in their hearts. Far away from a warning line, there was an unmarked black car parked beside an evergreen forest covered in ice. "I don't accept any interviews." Through the car window, Tai Ziwan looked at the dozens of reporters who were blocked out by the bodyguards. He asked calmly, "Have you all gone in?" Mr. Senator, Chief Editor Bob, and reporter would have entered the Supreme Court building and are now signing the transcript of the previous hearing. The subordinate replied in a low voice, "There was no accident. It was just that the Blackhawk sniper had some conflicts with the investigators of the Federation Investigation Bureau when he was controlling the position." Tai Ziwan rubbed his eyebrows and silently looked at the corner of the Supreme Court building above the frosty white forest. He didn't speak for a long time. Since he officially began the silent march last year, this was the first time that the young senator felt nervous, because he knew very well that whether the Patriot Act would be repealed or not was very important. 2 fugitives entered the Supreme Court to file an unconstitutional lawsuit, and they had just been handed over to him, but they had already begun this work that might take a long time. It looked a little rushed and even funny. Only his close subordinates knew how long Tai Ziwan had been preparing for this day. He just lacked a fuse, and Chief Editor Bob and Reporter Wood are the best fuses. The former Minister of Justice is the lead lawyer. The Dean of the Faculty of Law of Capital University is the second lawyer, and the former prosecutor Xiao Wenjing can only do odd jobs. In my opinion, with such a luxurious lineup, it won't be too difficult to win any case. Tai Ziwan took out a handkerchief and gently wiped the corners of his pale lips. He looked at the corner of the Supreme Court building and murmured, as if he wanted to boost his confidence. The subordinate next to him didn't seem to hear his murmur and reported in a clear tone. Last night, Mrs. Chow of Prime Minister then went to Pinecone Ridge to visit Chief Judge Jiang at your request. He looked up at Tai Ziyuan and continued. Until 3 o'clock in the morning, Chief Judge Ji still insisted that Chief Editor Bob and Reporter Wood's fugitive status had not been resolved, and they were not qualified to file an unconstitutional lawsuit. The corners of Lai Ziyuan's lips curled up slightly as he said mockingly, "If it weren't for the fact that the members of the PAC faction in Parliament Hill came up with an unconstitutional second-time limit bill, I would be very willing to personally fight this unconstitutional lawsuit." However, after confirming that the 3 manors in Bermuda have been permanently transferred to his wife, Chief Judge Ji has corrected his stubborn judicial concept. The subordinate continued to report, but his emotions were not as calm as his expression. He was in charge of bribery-related matters and knew very well that the 3 manors in Bermuda were not comparable to ordinary manors. He even believed that even Lin Banshan couldn't enjoy such a luxury in Bermuda. In his opinion, it was a pity to bribe such a hypocritical old judge who was about to die with such a large sum of money. However, he immediately remembered that the young senator in front of him had even donated the Crystal Mining Consortium without any hesitation, so he fell silent. There are a total of 5 justices in the Supreme Court's Constitutional Review Committee. After 2 years of work, we can only secure 2 votes. The other 2 justices obviously support the Patriot Act, so now it's 2-2. The subordinate's opinion was very clear. No matter how luxurious the lineup of lawyers Tai Ziyuan prepared was, the final decision of whether the Patriot Act would become a piece of scrap paper or continue to be shackled by the Federation was still the 5 justices. So in the end, it all depends on Chief Judge He Ying's opinion. Besides, even if he blinks, it's possible to directly change the opinion of the other 4 justices. It's a pity, or rather respectable, that Chief Judge He Ying can't be bribed. Tai Ziyuan said calmly, "If this old man can be bribed or influenced, I will directly ask lawyer He to do everything possible to bypass the principle of avoidance and appear in the Supreme Court today." Robbie Avenue suddenly became quiet. Tens of thousands of people stared at the building on the other side of the warning line calmly and attentively. Nobody spoke, because they who participated in the silent march still believed in the spirit of the Federation's charter and the Supreme Court that represented the dignity of the law. The soft sound of rolling snow echoed. The black car door opened, and Jian Shuer, wearing a plain dress, sat down. She lowered her head and gently patted the snow next to her knees. "Did you see it?" Tai Ziyuan did not turn around. He was still looking in that direction and asked. "I saw it," Jian Shuer replied. Hearing this simple answer, Tai Ziyuan's slightly furrowed eyebrows slowly relaxed. A faint and calm smile appeared on his face. Jian Shuer looked at the smile on his face. A trace of doubt flashed through her beautiful and bright eyes. She raised her eyebrows slightly and asked with a smile, "It seems that you are very confident." "The outcome of this case has been decided. We won." Tai Ziyuan turned around and looked at her beautiful face. He whispered, "Thank you." Jian Shuer raised her eyebrows even higher. She was like a willow leaf blown by the wind. She was not intimidating at all. Instead, she was confused and cute. "So you asked me to come and see Chief Judge He? But why are you so sure that I can play a role? Do you still remember the case that caused a sensation in the Federation when you were a child? A teenage girl defeated the UNICEF and the Lees of Philadelphia in court. Why? Why did the Supreme Court directly award the inheritance of the ancient clock company to Zhong Huiyin 4 years ago, ignoring the hints of the Federation government? You should know that other than the routine questioning, it only took less than 3 minutes in total." Tai Ziyuan looked at her and said with a smile, "Chief Judge He Ying has almost perfect morals and wisdom. He is wise and unrestrained. He can be said to be a model for all mankind. He has no shortcomings. Besides playing the piano and teaching his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, the whole Federation doesn't know what hobbies he has." Jian Shuer gradually felt a little strange. She held her chin and frowned as she listened. But I know that he has hobbies. This kind of hobby is not a shortcoming. But due to the high status of chief judge he and the dignity of the law that he has to protect, he can't express them to his heart. So this kind of emotion has been accumulating in the old man's heart for a long time and is getting stronger and stronger. Once there's an opportunity to express it, Chief Judge will never miss it. Jian Shuier vaguely guessed what he wanted to say. She stared at him in disbelief. Tai Yuan looked at her and said with a smile, I used to tell Su Lu that the greatest chief judge he Ing of the Federation likes little girls. I later understood that he has always liked you. Just you. Jian Shuier covered her mouth in shock and said, Was that possible? He is already 100 years old. Tai Yuan looked at her face that was still perfect and moving even though she was frightened. He sighed with emotion and said, The chief judge of the Supreme Court also has the right to chase after stars. A century-old man also has the right to like the most perfect woman created by the Creator. As soon as he finished speaking, a wave of cheers passed through the car window and entered the ears of the two people. They turned their heads and saw that the Supreme Court had become a sea of jubilation. Chief Editor Bob and reporter Wood held up their hands that were not handcuffed and walked out like heroes. Chief Judge He Ing of the Supreme Court of the Federation. When he first saw Jian Shuier on the TV screen, she didn't have purple hair yet. She hadn't boarded the Enterprise yet. She wasn't a national idol that everyone looked up to. She was just an orphan's nanny in a family sitcom. But from that day onwards, he began to love her. The Patriot Act that made it difficult for countless people in the Federation to breathe and subjected countless people to secret interrogation and torture was immediately abolished by him in his old voice. Was it really just for such a simple reason? Chapter 960. Around the lawn behind the official residence, dozens of Special Task Force agents holding black umbrellas vigilantly watched the surroundings. The entire street was under tight control. Beside a cedar tree, Director Breen, whose face was full of anxiety, looked at the two people on the lawn. Since he was not allowed to go forward, he could only nervously tell his subordinates to be more careful. President Pabre walked slowly on the snow-covered lawn. He wore a dark trench coat and held a black umbrella in his hand. The falling snowflakes silently landed on the umbrella and stuck to the front of his coat. Du Xiaoqing, who was silently following behind him, did not hold an umbrella. The general did not wear sunglasses today, and he wore black lambskin gloves on his hands. His dark military uniform was as straight as usual, without a single wrinkle. The snowflakes that fell on the uniform either fell or melted, dyeing it in different shades. He looked at the dark side of the president's face and suggested in a low voice that they return to the official residence. President Pabre shook his head and looked at the people on the other side of the lawn. He said, Because of the appearance of those rebel soldiers, they're a little too nervous. Du Xiaoqing maintained his silence. To define those soldiers as rebels, in my opinion, it is a little ridiculous, even shameless. President Pabre stopped walking and looked out from under the black umbrella, but he did not know where he was looking. He smiled bitterly and said, The official residence has received a report from the Ministry of Defense, and I believe you should have also seen the official accusation made by Colonel Yifeng. But it was not until last night, when I saw the officer in the wheelchair, that I dared to believe that everything that happened on the Mo Hua planet was true. He turned his head and looked at Du Xiaoqing quietly. He said, Now it seems that you were right to advise me not to appoint Hu Lien as the enemy's commander-in-chief. The things that he and Director Bailey have done will make the Federation government pay a great price. President Pabre did not know about the purge on the front line of the new 17th Division and the murder of the first 7 groups of soldiers. Even after receiving the report, he was still unwilling to believe that the senior officials who were loyal to the government would do such a thing. Not only were they cold-blooded and ugly, they were also so stupid. President Pabre thought about the attack on the sanatorium in Spring City. He thought about the accusation made by the member of Group 7 at the meeting last night. He thought about the small-eyed man who had returned to the Federation and was hiding in the darkness. He let out a deep sigh with a strong sense of self-mockery. There were also the parents of the members of Group 7. Mr. President's expression became even colder. He had a vague feeling that some troublesome and even extremely dangerous factors were about to appear, and it was something that he could not control. The silent Du Xiaoqing finally opened his mouth to speak. He looked at Pabre and said, "Mr. President, if a lion leads a flock of docile and incompetent sheep to battle, although it is hard, it is not necessarily a failure. But if a lion leads a flock of greedy aardwolves to battle, perhaps it will collapse before defeating the enemy." President Pabre frowned slightly and fell into silence. I still adhere to the views of that day. There are many people in the government and the military who are not worthy of trust and are not worthy of being relied on. Such people can only cause harm to our cause and will not be of any help. Du Xiaoqing's face was cold and indifferent. He said firmly, "The people I am referring to include Chairman Li Jiedu. Lieutenant General Hu Lian is his student. He is the leader of the infamous Joint Investigation Group. You should keep your distance from him." President Pabre looked at him and said after a moment of silence, "Du Xiaoqing, if you are willing to take out the patients on the battlefield and look at the history of human society, you will probably understand that Chairman Li's willingness to sully himself is in fact a kind of sacrifice." He waved his hand to stop Du Xiaoqing from continuing to suggest. He said in a deep voice, "Those families, especially those in the back of Macho Mountain, have been silent for too long. Now, they have the best opportunity. I believe that they will not continue to be silent. Your task now is to let the army make all the preparations. Of course, if the situation does not enter the most difficult and complicated situation, we will try not to let the army participate in these affairs." After saying this, the snow-covered lawn fell into silence again. After a long time, Du Xiaoqing stood at attention and saluted, and then left in the snow. Walking into the official residence, President Pabre handed the dripping black umbrella to the staff, took off his windbreaker and put it in his arms, and pushed open the heavy antique wooden door of the dining room. After entering the door, the worry on his face disappeared without a trace. Looking at his busy wife, he laughed loudly and said, "Dear, what are we having for lunch today?" The First Lady of the Federation turned around and took the windbreaker from his arms. She replied with a gentle smile, "Green beans and minced meat. There is hot soup on the table. Have a sip to warm your body. It seems that the snow will continue to cool down. I am afraid that it will not warm up until March." The First Lady began to tidy up the table and prepare lunch. She put the breadbasket in front of her husband, who was drinking soup. Then she turned on the TV and said casually, "Chairman Li has been coming to the official residence to eat much less recently. You also know that he is very busy these days." President Pabre lowered his head and drank the pepper soup. His tanned face showed a satisfied expression, and he praised exaggeratedly, "The soup still tastes so good. I feel hot all over after drinking 2 spoonfuls." Pretending that the food is delicious to please me. "You have been using this trick since we were dating. Don't you find it annoying?" The First Lady said with a smile, "This trick of yours is not as good as Colonel Su Li's. Every time he comes to eat, he doesn't need to say any words of praise, and he doesn't need to show any expression of praise. He just keeps eating with his head down and adds rice 3 or 4 times in a row." She suddenly remembered that she was talking about an old friend who had not eaten in the official residence for more than 3 years. She was talking about a prince of the empire, and she was talking about her husband's biggest enemy. She stopped talking gloomily. President Pabre held the spoon and looked at his wife silently for a long time. Suddenly, the wrinkles at the corner of his eyes deepened. He laughed and said, "That guy's just born with a big appetite. You have been fooled by him." The laughter gradually disappeared in the small dining room of the official residence. Nobody mentioned Su Lu anymore. President Pabre tore the bread and dipped it in the thick soup, mixed it with green beans and meat, and slowly ate it while watching the TV screen calmly. As the president of the Federation, he rarely watched the news channel of the Federation in his private life. It was the same at this time because even he did not like the so-called authoritative news channel that was tightly controlled by the government. The private TV station called April Flower was broadcasting important political news. The reporter, who could not hide his excitement, held the microphone and said loudly, "The Supreme Court has announced the immediate repeal of the Patriot Act by a vote of 4-1. More than 2 hours have passed since then, but the silent parade still has not left Robbie Boulevard. Tens of thousands of people are celebrating here, and we have found that more and more citizens of the Capitol are joining the celebration crowd." President Pabre did not hear what the reporter said at the end. The voice from the light screen entered his ears and turned into fuzzy noise, making his face turn ugly. He knew the news the moment the Supreme Court announced the immediate repeal of the Patriot Act. That was why he had been walking slowly in the snow with Du Shaoqing earlier. Just when the major forces of the Federation thought that the Federation government he led would suffer a huge setback because of the unconstitutional review and that the president would fly into a rage, he remained calm. He could even quietly have a simple lunch with his wife in the small dining room. President Pabre thought that he could continue to be calm, but he did not expect to see the news at the dinner table full of family love and warmth. It was a completely different feeling from hearing the news in the Oval Office. Listening to the excited reports of the reporters and watching the ordinary people who had been passionately or silently supporting him for more than a decade, more and more people joining the opposition, he suddenly felt that the thick pepper soup had become tasteless. A pair of warm hands gently fell on his shoulders and slowly rubbed back and forth to express their sympathy. President Pabre patted him gently. His wife stood behind his chair and said softly, "Papa, don't forget that I was a lawyer in the past. Although I was only your assistant, I knew that there was a problem with the Patriot Act from the first day I saw it." President Pabre was silent for a moment before he replied, "My dear, I know very well that the Patriot Act is not only problematic, but also completely evil." He turned his head, looked at his wife, and said solemnly, "But at this moment, the Federation needs this evil law, just like a dying patient needs illegal psycho-stimulating drugs to help them survive the surgery. It is easy for people with a legal background to judge that once the Patriot Act enters the unconstitutional review process, it will definitely be nullified by the Supreme Court of that old judge. So, the government and I have done a lot of procedures to protect it." He stood up, and a self-deprecating smile flashed on his tanned face. He continued, "But the government did not expect that our enemies would be so unscrupulous and start to use violent means when we, who have the most powerful violent organization, have been exercising self-discipline with great difficulty." This sentence was referring to the attack on the sanatorium in Spring City. "Was it done by those big families?" his wife asked worriedly. President Pabre shook his head and said, "It was done by Su Lu. Whether or not they were behind it, those big families will never admit it, and the government cannot find any evidence." Hearing Su Li's name, a hint of shock flashed on his wife's face. Then, she sighed softly and did not say anything more. She picked up the tray and left. Pushing open the door of the bedroom on the second floor, she looked at her daughter, who was playing mobile games by the window, and said with a smile, "Della, it's time for dinner." Miss Padel looked up at her mother with a sweet smile, put down the phone, and walked over. The first daughter of the Federation had now grown into a beautiful young lady, but she still seemed unwilling to talk. Stroking her daughter's curly hair lovingly, the wife sighed and said, "It's been 3 years. Su Lu is indeed a citizen of the Empire. My dear, when will you forgive your father and eat at the same table with him?" Chapter 961. The Supreme Court of the Federation announced the immediate repeal of the Patriot Act. For some people of the Federation, it was like the sun dispelling the haze, but for some people of the Federation, it was more like the night shrouding the earth again. The jubilant celebration did not happen in all the cities. In some places, angry Pabre loyalists took to the streets, waving their fists in protest. Even a highly respected Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was criticized and questioned on the internet and in the media, which was extremely rare. But at least on the two sides of Robbie Boulevard that were occupied by the silent march, and around the Supreme Court building that was packed with people, there were no conflicts of ideas or factions. Countless people were jumping in excitement, shouting slogans, and welcoming the brave heroes in their hearts. The officials of the Joint Investigation Department, who had been waiting outside the cordon with gloomy expressions, had already left in embarrassment amidst the violent boos and curses of the people. With the repeal of the Patriot Act, the government of the Federation could no longer take coercive measures against the two journalists. Chief Editor Wood and reporter Bob raised their hands high like heroes and walked out amidst the deafening cheers. At the front of the crowd were their most familiar colleagues. The reporters and editors of the Capital Special District Daily looked at the chief editor and Wood, who they had not seen for many days. They were both excited and sad. Some women wiped away the tears on their faces and squeezed out cheerful smiles. Taurus was the full-time secretary of Chief Editor Bob. The woman, who was in her 40s and had light blonde wavy hair, came forward while sobbing, opened her arms, and gave the chief editor a warm hug, which caused the exaggerated laughter of the people around them and a weird smile on Wood's face. She put on the windbreaker for Bob with trembling fingers, then took out a high-quality coarse tobacco from the box and carefully put it into Bob's mouth. Chief Editor Bob lit the coarse tobacco, took 2 deep puffs, and then handed it to Wood, who was full of resentment. Looking at the tears on his secretary's face, he said with a smile, "Don't cry. People will laugh at you." "Okay," Taurus answered with a sobbing tone. She wiped the tears off her face and walked to his side naturally. She asked seriously, "Are you going back to the news agency?" Chief Editor Bob and reporter Wood subconsciously looked at each other, then looked at the other side of Robbie Avenue that was also crowded and lively. They looked at the young counselor who was surrounded by reporters and people. Does the repeal of the Patriot Act represent true freedom? The noisy cheers of the tens of thousands of people around them made the 2 middle-aged men, who were known as the conscience of the Federation's press, frown at the same time. They thought of the horrible noises in the cells of the Joint Investigation Department and the gloomy time in captivity. They had not obtained true freedom yet, as they could not return to the newspaper office to write editorials and conduct investigations. Once they left the noisy sea of people that was completely inconsistent with the silent march, there was a high possibility that they would be assassinated, get into a car accident, jump off a building, be framed in some absurd criminal case, or be mentally ill. Councilman Fong knows the situation we are in, so he has been silent since last night. He did not tell us much, so he knows that we, the 2 of us who have been labeled as heroes, have to stay by his side. Chief Editor Bob looked into the distance and said to Wood, who was next to him, "Right now, we are indeed very helpful to the silent march movement, so I don't mind helping them." Wood held a thick cigarette between his fingers and shrugged. "I just hate the feeling of being forced, as if we are still in prison." Chief Editor Bob said calmly, "Imprisoning the body has nothing to do with the mind. Now that you and I can be heard by the people, we are no longer in prison. And I also want to know if Councilman Fong will be the second President Pabre." He turned his head to look at Wood, smiled, and patted him on the shoulder. He said, "You don't have to go back to the newspaper office. Pick up the pen, and you can still take revenge on society." In January of the 76th year of the constitutional calendar, the snow fell and rested. No one knew when the sparkling snowflakes would fall from the lead-gray clouds again. Only the cold wind continued to blow. In the cold wind, Taiwan's thin body looked particularly thin, and his face was getting paler and paler. The people around him couldn't help but worry that the young councilman would collapse after coughing again. The reporters who ran the political line all knew that Councilman Fong was not in good health, but no one in the press knew the real reason why his health was getting worse. But for them, pity was the emotion of the fanatical people, but it was definitely not the emotion they should have for the interview. So they held their microphones and recording pens high and continued to ask questions without pause. Taizan raised his hands and gestured for the crowd to quiet down. Then he answered the reporter in front of him with a serious expression, although Chief Editor Bob and reporter would have been cleared of the ugly and unfair accusations, and the government has to formally apologize and explain this. The government has to bear the relevant judicial responsibility for the cruel and inhumane treatment the two of them suffered during the interrogation by the Joint Investigation Department. The reporter asked, "Councilman, do you mean to pursue criminal responsibility? Then which of the government's serial departments will be involved in the indictment?" The Patriot Act has been abolished, so the Joint Investigation Department, which has dangerous high authority, has lost all reason to exist. It must be disbanded immediately. Tai Ziyuan's answer was simple and direct, and it was strong and powerful. A male reporter squeezed to the front of the crowd, raised the recording pen in his hand, and asked loudly, during the silent march last night, the first 7 groups officer, Da Vinci, appeared on the podium and claimed that he was persecuted by the government. But according to the military's investigation, this officer fled after killing his comrades on the front lines of Planet Amohua. There are related videos, and many soldiers of the new 11th Division can prove that this person once colluded with the Empire soldiers. This person, called Da Vinci, has been confirmed as a rebel, letting a rebel officer viciously attack the soldiers of the Federation who were still fighting on the front lines, shamelessly framing the Federation government in order to wash away his sins. Mr. Councilman, how do you plan to explain this matter? The reporters present knew very well that this male reporter was from the Tribune, which was close to Pabre's government, but they also wanted to know how Tai Ziyuan would answer. The Tribune reporter did not end his sharp questions there. He threw out another bombshell and asked, "According to the Bureau of Proclamation, a spy of the Empire has infiltrated the Federation. With the political situation in the Federation in turmoil, what does the Empire want to do? You and your demonstration team have seriously interfered with the daily operations of the government and caused great harm to the front lines. Is there any connection between the rebel officer named Da Vinci, the abolition of the Patriot Act, the Empire's people, and this silent march? In the context of this war, any factor that involved the Empire would become sensitive and dangerous." Hearing the reporter's question, the crowd suddenly fell silent. Countless eyes fell on Tai Ziyuan's face. Tai Ziyuan narrowed his eyes and stared at the reporter coldly. He found that the other party did not back down, but had a provocative look. He vaguely guessed that the government was looking for the right time to announce his former friendship with the Empire's Prince Su Lu as the most powerful countermeasure. Da Vinci is a rebel? Tai Ziyuan stared at the other party coldly. His voice became sharper and more unyielding. Then is he a rebel who fought on the front lines for 4 years, or a rebel whose legs were blown off and will be disabled for life? Without waiting for the Tribune reporter to refute, Tai Ziyuan narrowed his eyes and said coldly, "I'm a retired officer of the glorious Federation. I've not only held a pen in my hand like you, I've also held a gun. I'm not hiding in the safety of the Capitol ring, sitting on the sofa with a pen in my hand and killing imaginary soldiers of the Empire in order to love some people of the Federation." Tai Ziyuan stared at the reporter, who had an extremely ugly expression, and said word by word, "I've been on the front lines. I've resisted the invasion of the Empire with the guns and bullets in my hands. I've killed countless soldiers of the Empire who rushed in front of me. Those cruel and barbaric soldiers of the Empire are not just imaginary images that only exist in the minds of people like you. They are real people. Therefore, you should ask the people of the Empire what they want to do, not me. If you and your newspaper company try to connect me with the people of the Empire in the future and insult the dignity and honor of a retired officer of the Federation, I will not hesitate to shoot you, just like I did to the people of the Empire." The Tribune reporter looked at the thin and weak young senator in shock. He was at a loss for what to do because of the sudden pressure from the other party. He subconsciously waved his arms and shouted to his colleagues around him, "He's threatening me. Did you see that? A senator is using threats to fight against the freedom of the press." He thought that the words, such as the freedom of the press and threats, would easily provoke the emotions of the reporters around him, but he only received indifferent and mocking gazes. It was because he did not understand that since he and his newspaper company dared to insinuate Tai Ziyuan in the name of righteousness that was too sensitive to be touched, then Tai Ziyuan could naturally use the name of righteousness to counterattack in the most forceful and even violent way. As for your claim that the political situation of the Federation is chaotic and that the Empire will take advantage of the situation and accuse the people who participated in the silent march, which will affect the battle of the front lines, I would like to give the following official answer. In the cold wind, the young senator looked at the microphone and recording pen in front of him and said solemnly, "If you believe Major Da Vinci's accusation, then you should understand that what the Federation government and certain high-ranking military officers are doing on planet Amohua is not ostracizing, suppressing, or purging. They're shooting behind the backs of the brave and fearless soldiers who are bathed in blood. This is pure murder." Here, I would like to ask all of the citizens of the Federation to consider who is the real threat to the Federation right now, between this government and the Empire. The crowd fell into a deathly silence. Highly recommended a super urban pretentious book, The School Beauty's Bodyguard. Book number 1931432. Fishman Too's newest supernatural work after So Pure, So Flirtatious. Lin, he was a normal 12th grader, but he had another important task on his shoulders, and that was to woo the school beauty, on the orders of the beauty's father, too. Lin, he really didn't want to interact with this difficult miss, but he couldn't go against the orders of his elders. He had no choice but to transfer to Songshan's first school to be the Mrs. Follower. And thus, the most awesome follower in history appeared, the Mrs. Bodyguard. Watch this follower get rich, steal the miss, and start his life of picking up girls. Chapter 962. Silence, silence. Tai Ziwan did not continue his outburst. He turned to the reporter who asked the first question and said softly, "You just asked how far he should go. My request is simple. Parliament must hold a special hearing to investigate the explosion of the ancient bell, the 7-group incident on planet Amohua, and immediately reopen the impeachment case. All suspected criminal officials of the Federation government must be put on trial. The trial of the conspirators." This was the headline of the special issue published by the Tribune, one of the 3 major newspapers of the Federation, that night. The special issue believed that there was an unspeakable conspiracy behind the major events of the Federation in the past 6 months. Some decadent reactionary families intended to incite the blind people, provoke the antagonism of the dangerous classes, and intensify social conflicts, so as to carry out a strong counterattack to achieve the goal of prolonging the sinful lives. The content of the 3 major pages of the report carried out and even developed the illusions or insinuations of the reporter during the day. It directly pointed the spearhead at the silent march, at the silent 7 families, and at the young Senator Tai Ziwan. Below the eye-catching headline on the front page was a political article written by President Pabre himself. In the article, he calmly answered some of the most important questions of the people and expressed his views on the political affairs of the Federation in the past 3 years. Then in the conclusion, he wrote, "The real enemy of tolerance is fanaticism. But the ones who challenge tolerance are often not those fanatics with firm beliefs, but often these people. They want to dispel their own doubts, and at the same time, they want to seal the mouths of others and bind their hands and feet. They want to bind our hands and feet, so they do everything they can to repeal the Patriot Act. They want to seal the mouths of others, so they use all kinds of means to threaten, hold, or bribe the media." George Carlin once said that the only strength the will of the weak can possess is fanaticism. If the cowardly strong who control the resources of society will only use the last strength of the weak like you and me to achieve their own personal goals, then why should we be lenient to them? Note 1. Mr. President's writing was still strong and moving, like the eloquence on the podium, but in today's Federation, it could no longer arouse as many enthusiastic responses and support as it did in the past. There were many people who were deep in thought when they saw the text, but no matter what school of thought they were, they all maintained a cautious silence for the time being. The next morning, another major newspaper that had been silent for a long time, the Capital Special District Daily News, made a quick response. In an inconspicuous corner of the second page, the editors enthusiastically cheered for the freedom of the chief editor and chief reporter. At the same time, They published a simple response from Mr. Bob to the president at the end. If the opposite of fanaticism is callousness, then when you choose callousness, don't blame the people for naturally choosing fanaticism. Inside the temporary tent in front of the George Carlin Art Center, Chief Editor Bob, who had not slept all night, picked up a half-extinguished coarse cigarette and took a sip. He then rubbed his dry eyes and was about to drink the bitter coffee that Taurus personally prepared to end the second official political essay when he saw would lift the curtain and come in. The response is simple and powerful, but why is it on the second page? Reporter Wood grabbed his coffee cup and took a sip. He frowned at the bitter and thick juice, then shook his head and said, "Taurus really knows your habits. But when did you go through the divorce procedures? She has been waiting for you for so many years. The opposition of the children is greater." Chief Editor Bob smiled bitterly and said, "This just answers your first question. In my opinion, responding to Mr. President's cliché is not even as important as dealing with family issues." Wood waved the special issue of the Forum that he had read all night and said with emotion, "Mr. Pabre, who has relied on the fanatical support of the people for decades to grow from an orphan in a mining area to the president of the Federation, has actually started to be wary of the word fanaticism. This is really a ridiculous thing. History is always easy to make those who have lived long enough to feel ridiculous." Bob said, "That year, that Senator Medellin wrote more than a dozen eloquent editorials. Who would have thought that he was from the Empire at that time? Who would have thought that his opponent in the election would actually start to write editorials now? Political history will always be so boring and repetitive." Wood frowned and looked at the demonstrators who were consciously cleaning up the garbage outside the tent. He said thoughtfully, "Will Tai Ziwan be different? The difference between politicians and politicians is like the difference between a painter and a painter. The former can't retain the original truth and feelings, and is always a repetitive manual work. They only need to achieve their goals, such as making money or fame." Chief Editor Bob said with emotion, "When Pabre stepped into the politics of the Federation from a down-and-out law firm, we had just entered the news circle. Since then, I have been shouting and defending for him, because I feel that he is an anomaly in the political circle. He is a fresh stream, and he is most likely to become a politician, not a politician with a stomach full of lust and a brain full of bank card passwords. Unfortunately, the reality is always so disappointing." In the end, he still walked the path of a politician who plays tricks. As for the young senator you're concerned about, I think he has already done an excellent job in terms of rallying the people, stirring up opposing emotions, and controlling the fanatical atmosphere. If you carefully analyze the answer with the Tribune reporter, you will realize that he didn't actually give the real answer to any of the sharp questions, but it was enough to convince the spectators that he was right. Because of his family background, the ambition in our eyes is only natural in his eyes, so no one can capture any unpleasant feeling in his body. He has an innate aura that makes people feel peaceful and trusting. Wood frowned and asked, "This is not a talent show. What are you trying to say?" Bob smiled and said, "What I want to say is that this young senator has calmness and ability beyond his age. He is already a mature politician. He is the second Pabre, even more mature than Pabre." Wood was silent. Of course, from the current situation, to defeat a successful politician like President Pabre, you do need a politician like Pabre. Bob spread his hands helplessly and said, "Or an unreasonable method like Group 7. The problem is that I don't like either of those," Wood said with a frown. Bob said self-deprecatingly, "Hypocritical and cowardly so-called intellectuals like you and me will of course insist on the system and place all our hopes on the word system. Unfortunately, this kind of hope is very much like talking in a dream. The system that has lasted for tens of thousands of years under the glory of the Charter will also have this kind of big problem." Wood suddenly said, "Perhaps there has never been such a creature as a politician in the world. Anyone who has been in contact with politics for a long time will become a politician." Bob stood up, opened the tent's curtain, and looked at the silent military headquarters beside the arts center in the distance. After a moment of silence, he said, Do you still remember the famous ending of Schiller's novel? Which one? Wood asked. Is it the report under the gallows? Yes. Bob quietly looked at the orderly demonstrators and murmured in a low voice. Kind people, you must be vigilant. Note 2. Not many people would be like Bob and Wood, who had just been released from prison and were protected by the silent military, but began to have profound or amorous concerns and vigilance about the young senator. Most of the vigilant eyes were still on President Pabre and the government. Several well-known liberal media outlets explained the significance of the repeal of the Patriot Act on a large page, and at the same time reprinted Bob's simple response to the president's political views. They also sharply questioned the government for the first time in 3 years. Why did the news channel of the Federation only broadcast a short message about the repeal of the Patriot Act without any video content? Did it mean that the government was seriously interfering with the freedom of the press? And why did the Joint Investigation Department not show any signs of disbanding? For 3 years, in order to cater to the public opinion of the Federation, and also because of the Patriot Act and the Joint Investigation Department, few media outlets other than the Capital Special District Daily News would make such tough inquiries. Now that the Patriot Act was repealed, they finally showed their courage. Perhaps in response to this courage and pressure from all sides, the Federation Parliament quickly convened a special meeting. However, to everyone's surprise and even shock, the special meeting had nothing to do with the several political demands of the silent military. There was no investigation of the explosion of the antique bell, no investigation of Group 7. The special meeting on Parliament Hill attempted to pass a brand new bill called the Homeland Security Act, and most of the contents of the bill were exactly the same as the Patriot Act. Only then did people remember that Pabre's faction still had an absolute advantage in terms of the number of senators on Parliament Hill. This was his parliament. The atmosphere on Parliament Hill today was as calm as usual, or it could be said that it was extremely depressing and silent. Only the staff carrying materials were walking back and forth between the seats. After the midterm elections, the opposing senators were used to failure. The only thing they needed to do was not raise their hands during the voting. Even so, they could not stop the bills and regulations from being passed. So, many people simply chose to sleep. After all, they could not raise their hands under their heads. Please raise your hands. The security guard on Parliament Hill looked at the young officer in the wheelchair expressionlessly. He gestured for him to raise his hands and then took out a detector to check. He did not even miss the gray blanket covering the disabled officer's broken leg. Since the tragic death of Vice President Byron and several senators on Parliament Hill that year, the security measures on Parliament Hill had become extremely tight. No one could enter the building with a gun. After the check, Da Vinci pushed the wheelchair through the door. He stroked this sore part of his broken leg from time to time. The expression on his determined face was unusually calm. No one, including the security guard, would have thought that the rebel wanted by the Federation government would dare to appear on Parliament Hill. Note 1. I forgot where I copied the first 2 paragraphs, but the sentence by George Carlin was said by Nietzsche. Note 2. The report under the gallows of Volchik. Note 3. I have not seen any of the famous passages in The Spy. I am only responsible for copying them. Above. Chapter 963. Voting represented the political rights that the people gave to the members of Parliament. Raising or lowering their hands represented their attitude. However, in Parliament Hill, some members were playing with their fingers in boredom, some were sleeping on their arms, and some were playing games on their phones. The National Security Advisor was explaining the Homeland Security Law in detail, and the members of the PAC faction were asking questions with a serious expression. Occasionally, there would be warm applause, but in the eyes of these minority members, it was as if it didn't exist. Since the problem couldn't be solved through voting, then it was better to just silently resist. Members of Parliament, Parliament Hill is the last bastion of justice for the Federation. In order to win this war with the Empire, in order to protect the greatest justice of the people, I hereby ask that you raise your hands and pass the Homeland Security Law. The National Security Advisor ended his explanation and nodded with a smile, indicating that he should step down. The host of the meeting looked at the schedule and said into the microphone, "Next, let's welcome Lieutenant Colonel Yun Peng from the Department of Defense to speak." On the pathway paved with expensive wooden planks, a wheelchair slowly and firmly moved up. The young officer on the wheelchair had a firm expression, as calm as the blanket covering his broken leg. "Are you Colonel Yun Peng?" The host frowned as he looked at the wheelchair in front of the podium, feeling that this officer looked somewhat familiar. The officer shook his head and replied, "No, I'm Major Da Vinci from the new 17th Division." Hearing this name, the members of Parliament who were playing with their fingers in boredom stiffened. The members who were sleeping on their arms suddenly sat up straight, and the members who were playing games on their phones subconsciously looked up. The originally lifeless Parliament Hill was suddenly filled with exclamations. A few members of the Pack faction stood up in shock. After hesitating for a moment to confirm the identity of this person, they began to shout for the guards. The guards at the various entrances quickly rushed to the podium. Da Vinci, who was sitting in the wheelchair, didn't seem to notice the danger at all. He stared at the dense crowd of members of Parliament below the podium and spoke at an extremely fast speed. Mr. National Security Advisor said that Parliament Hill is the last bastion of justice for the Federation. You are sitting here because the people have given you the right to sit here. Then why can't you take the time to listen to the voices of the real soldiers on the front lines? The guards had already rushed to the rostrum. The guard at the front pulled out a stun baton from his waist. A guard grabbed his wheelchair, and a guard roughly grabbed his collar, tried to twist his two remaining hands to the handcuffs behind his back. With his wheelchair overturned, Leonardo da Vinci struggled with all his might. His military uniform that was densely decorated with military medals and decorations was torn apart. Lying on the ground, he looked at the distant dome of Parliament Hill and roared angrily, "Damn it, you bunch of cowards!" Faced with this disabled officer's angry reprimand, some of the counselors frowned slightly. Then they slowly lowered their heads and continued to play with their fingers. The other counselors stood up and waved their arms, cursing angrily in response. They also booed him mercilessly. At this moment, the counselor who was playing mobile games frowned. He slammed his mobile phone on the table and said, Wait for the rebel officers to deliver a vicious speech attacking the Federation on Parliament Hill. Larry, you have to remember that this is the Sacred Federation's meeting room, not the gathering place of some hooligans. Please remember your identity and don't do anything stupid." Da Vinci was pressed to the wooden floor by the guards. In his eyes were the magnificent crystal chandelier hanging in the dome and the rostrum high above. He was still sad, but he did not have the tragic feeling of a desperate person. He gave up resistance and laughed loudly like a lunatic. The Federation News Channel is broadcasting the meeting room live. The whole Federation is watching how you treat a disabled major. Mr. Counselors, it seems that you are really not worried about being abandoned by the voters. No one believed the threat of this officer. Indeed, there were 12 cameras set up by the Federation News Channel in front and behind the rostrum. However, this was the usual practice of the Parliament Mountain. There was no news broadcast today. At this moment, the main light screen behind the rostrum suddenly lit up like a white wall. The quality of the light screen was very poor. Only a few blurry faces could be seen, but the logo of the Federation News Channel clearly appeared in the upper left corner of the screen. Under the logo, there were two clear words, "Live Broadcast." The whole Parliament Mountain was in an uproar. The counselors who had just sat down after satisfying their anger and curses stood up again in shock. They looked around for possible surveillance cameras, as if they had seen a ghost. The picture gradually became clear, revealing a handsome but extremely violent face. Next to this face, there were 7 or 8 officers wearing the uniform of the Federation. The Parliament Mountain gradually quieted down. All the counselors' eyes fell on the light screen and recognized the identity of this officer. It was a video email from the forward base of Planet Inkflower from the front line of the war. In the video email, the young and proud colonel of the Federation frowned and stared coldly at the camera. He said, "As a soldier of the Federation, I should not be involved in politics. However, because of the request of a woman I love, I will make an exception and make the following explanation to the Parliament of the Federation and the people. There are 3 sentences in total. I am Colonel Lifone, the current commander of the 17th Division of the Federation's 1st Military Region. The officers next to me are all officers of the 17th Division. I don't know what Major Da Vinci wants to say when he enters Parliament Mountain. I only know that he is definitely not a rebel officer. That's all I have to say. After a few simple sentences, the video email ended. The projection of the Parliament Mountain Master returned to the live broadcast of the news channel of the Federation. In other words, it returned to the scene of the Parliament Mountain. Hundreds of counselors looked at themselves on the light screen with complicated expressions. Looking at the eye-catching live broadcast logo, thinking about the testimony of Colonel Lifone, they fell into a long silence. In any case, the simple testimony of a colonel of the Federation was definitely not enough to overthrow the command of the Federation military. Not to mention, the way he gave his testimony was so ridiculous and comical that it showed such disrespect to Parliament Mountain. However, this colonel was called Lifone. He was the hero of the Federation, Madman Lee, the only son of Chairman Lee J. Dew, and the direct successor of the Lees of Philadelphia. Therefore, the weight of these 3 simple sentences was different. The silence of Parliament Mountain was broken by 2 uneasy counselors. They looked at the confused military police below the rostrum and shouted, "Why aren't you arresting him? What do you want to do?" At this time, sitting at the highest point of the rostrum, the old man who seemed to be in a deep sleep for the past 3 years and had almost never opened his mouth except when he had to speak suddenly opened his eyes slowly. In order to achieve an earlier speech than yesterday, this chapter was only written at 2,000 words. Chapter 964. The Deputy Speaker of the Federation Management Committee, Mr. Zion, glanced at the hundreds of members in the audience with his old eyes and said lightly, "Since even Colonel Lifone believes that Major Leonardo da Vinci is not a rebel, then I think we should listen to what Major Leonardo da Vinci has to say." The members of the Pack faction, who had the absolute majority, were stunned and began to get restless. Zion's eyes were cold as he scolded in a deep voice, "Members, this disabled Major Leonardo da Vinci doesn't have a gun on him. Is he a threat to your safety? Pay attention to your manners. The whole Federation is watching you." The first time in 3 years that the Deputy Speaker of the Federation made a strong statement. It seemed that it was not enough to simply suppress the members of the Pack faction, who had become used to being tough after the midterm elections. The members of the Black Me faction were still protesting loudly. The face of the Deputy Speaker of the Federation was slightly gloomy. He raised the hammer in his right hand and slammed it on the smooth and hard pair wood castanets. The crisp and resounding sound of the collision suddenly resounded throughout the spacious Parliament Hill. But it did not end there. As the Deputy Speaker slowly and monotonously raised his arm and brought the hammer down, the sound continued to ring out, overlapping like the waves of the sea, one wave after another. The noise of the drums gradually quieted down, and the sound of the hammer stopped abruptly. The eyes of the Deputy Speaker of the Federation were slightly closed, as if he was about to fall asleep again. However, the words that came out of his mouth were indifferent. "If anyone disturbs the order of the meeting again, I will ask the military police to take him out for 3 days." The members of the Pack faction in the audience looked at each other. They were used to the silence of the old man, sitting at the highest seat of the chairman. It was not until now that they remembered that although they had the absolute advantage in the vote on the Parliament Hill, as the Deputy Speaker, he had a lot of procedural rights that were stipulated in the Charter. After a moment of silence and awkwardness, the most fanatical member could only suppress his anger and uneasiness and sit down angrily. The military police under the podium awkwardly let go of Leonardo da Vinci, put down the wheelchair, and then carried him to the chair. The wheelchair slowly moved to the microphone. Leonardo da Vinci carefully tidied up his military uniform and arranged the military medal neatly on the left side of his chest. Then he combed his hair with his fingers, pulled down the microphone, and calmed down for a moment before he began to speak. Almost at the same time, countless phones rang in the arms of the members of Parliament one after another. Hundreds of secretaries in the offices of the members of Parliament ran madly through the corridors with their phones and folders in their hands, looking for their members. What was happening on Parliament Hill was being broadcasted live on the Federation News Channel and shown on the public's TV screens. Suddenly realizing that this seemingly meaningless meeting had an unexpected turn of events, the ordinary people could only express their shock and confusion. Meanwhile, the faces hidden behind the counselors reacted immediately and dialed their phones. Winsky stood beside a secluded passageway in the Capitol Airport. Looking at the TV screen above his head, he subconsciously covered his mouth and almost exclaimed. She looked around nervously, worried that she would attract other people's attention. She quickly put down her hand and tidied up her slightly curly hair. As the most popular female news anchor in the Federation in the past 10 years, the dignified and intelligent Winsky had a face that the public was most familiar with. Therefore, even though she was wearing huge sunglasses and ordinary clothes, she still felt that the passers-by were pointing at her as if they had recognized her. On the screen, the Federation News Channel was broadcasting the sudden turn of events on Parliament Hill. Logically speaking, such a major news event should have been hosted by her. However, no one would have thought that she was preparing to leave the Federation. If this hadn't happened, I probably wouldn't have appeared on the TV screen, because the news channel definitely wouldn't have broadcasted this. Winsky looked at the young military officer in the wheelchair on the screen and thought gloomily. She gripped the exquisite lady's handbag so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "Looks like you're very punctual." A pale-faced man in a black suit silently appeared beside her. He smiled softly and said, "But there's no need to be so nervous. Those special task force agents didn't follow us." The female anchor, Winsky, asked in a trembling voice, "There are some things that I don't understand. If you want to deal with him, why didn't you expose the matter between me and him? Instead, you sent me away at this time." Han Chu didn't answer her question and walked directly into the quiet passage. Winsky bit her lip lightly, picked up the expensive handbag in her hand, and followed in quick steps. She hated the man in front of her, but she was more afraid of him. Every time she saw him, she felt that he was like a poisonous snake covered in slime. However, things had developed to this point, and she had no other choice. This passage was probably for the maintenance staff of the airport. It was quiet and empty. When they reached the end of the passage, Han Chu stopped and looked back at the beautiful female anchor. He said calmly, "Moral scandals can never really hurt a politician. What's more, we know that you've always felt very guilty towards the First Lady. For you, it's more unacceptable for the family in the official residence to be hurt than for the president to be threatened." Winsky held the strap of the lady's handbag tightly and didn't say anything. Han Chu continued expressionlessly. "So, when we found out about the relationship between you and the president, we only asked you to help us do things in the news channel. If we asked for more, you definitely wouldn't accept. But why do you want me to leave?" Winsky asked nervously. A strange smile flashed across Han Chu's pale face. He said, "Now that the news channel has started broadcasting, the Silent March team has entered the capital. You're no longer of much use to us. Of course, we can leave you alone, but I think the president will vent his anger on you afterward." Winsky slowly lowered her head. Behind the wide sunglasses was a sad expression. She said in a trembling voice, "No, he wouldn't do that to me. You should know better than us what kind of man the president is." Han Chu looked at her with slight ridicule and said, "If you really believe that he wouldn't be so heartless, you wouldn't have agreed to leave the Federation today." Winsky raised her head and stared at his pale face. She asked, "Even if he wants to kill me, why do you care if I live or die? Exposing the president's lover is already beyond the boundary of a sex scandal. It's very useful to you. You are indeed the best news anchor in the Federation. Even at this time, your mind is still so clear." Han Chu sighed with a complicated expression. He looked at her and said, "What you said was actually my initial plan. Unfortunately, this insidious and perfect plan was rejected by him because he thought that there was indeed love between you and the president. He felt that this kind of thing should be respected. Winsky held the strap of the handbag tightly and didn't speak again. She knew that the man beside her was talking about, was the underworld king of Bermuda. However, as the president's secret lover, it was difficult for her to be shocked by other so-called big shots. She just silently listened to the words of love relayed by the other party, and then silently asked herself in her heart if she had betrayed love. I didn't betray you. Sitting on a spaceship heading to Bermuda in the southwest part of the capital airport, the female anchor looked at the familiar scenery outside the window and silently said in her heart, "In the beginning, I really wanted to protect you, but I didn't expect that those Bermudians would have such a terrifying degree of control over people's hearts." There was a thin layer of snow on the side of the spaceship. The new type of snow-melting agent was working efficiently. The layer of snow quickly turned into a strange pattern. The female anchor looked out of the window. Her fingertips pierced deeply into her palms. There were traces of blood oozing out. Perhaps it was because of this that the skin around the sunglasses was unusually pale. "My love, I'm sorry, good luck." The spaceship to Bermuda was about to take off. Sadly, she sent the last text message to the man in the official residence and then turned off the phone. Not far away, beside the transparent wall of the underground passage of the airport, Han Chu silently watched the spaceship disappear into the lead clouds. A faint smile appeared on his pale cheeks. Then he took out his phone and dialed a number. He whispered, "It's done." Black ordinary roads traversed the fields. In the Federation's old-style farms, it was extremely rare, so it retained a lot of the flavor of the past. Lin Banshan hung up the phone and looked at the snow-covered haystacks and frozen water wheels passing by the car window from time to time. His face showed a look of yearning and admiration. The car stopped in front of a very inconspicuous courtyard. Lin Banshan walked to the wooden door and politely knocked on the door. The courtyard door opened and a two-story wooden building appeared. An old man was grinding dried corn with a coarse stone in front of the porch. He didn't look up, but seemed to know who the visitor was. He smiled and asked, "Kid, you should be in the capital at this time?" In this world, even the old men in the Lin Manor didn't dare to call Lin Banshan kid. Probably only this old man was qualified. Lin Banshan still maintained the carefree attitude he had for the past 20 years. He walked to the porch and sat down on a small stool. He began to grind the dried corn with him. He lowered his head and answered casually, "Someone in the capital is handling it. If nothing unexpected happens, the Pabre government will definitely fall into a quagmire. As for whether there will be any difficult problems in the future, it's a matter for Madame and Sulu. I don't care, and I don't have the ability to care. You can't expect us gangsters and the regular army to fight head-on. So you came to grind corn with this old man." The old man looked up and asked. The wrinkles on his forehead were much deeper than before. Lin Banshan found that grinding dried corn was a very hard job. He rolled up his sleeves and complained while grinding hard. "You didn't want to live in the ranch that the Thai family arranged for you. You didn't want to live in the manor that I bought for you. You just had to come to such a rural place. Are you really not going to play golf?" "I like to play golf because I have to deal with some machine or computer data every second. I want to get closer to nature so that my brain doesn't become mechanical." The old man used his hand to scoop the ground corn into the old-style bamboo basin. He coughed twice and said, "But speaking of nature, what activity is closer to nature than farming? If I were in Bermuda, I would definitely open a pig farm." With your status publicly declaring that you want to violate the Wildlife Protection Act under the spirit of the Charter, isn't this a bit inappropriate? Lin Banshan wiped the sweat on his forehead and threw away the half of the jade stick in his hand. He said, "Old man, before you die, can you do something good?" "I retired a long time ago," the old man said with a smile. "I'll make a pot of porridge for you later. It'll be delicious. Don't use food to brush me off. Of course, you don't have to care about the government's affairs and the military's affairs. But don't forget, at that time, when you took advantage of my young age to coerce me into joining the Bureau. Serving the Charter is a lifelong career." Lin Banshan said, "In that case, even if you retire, as long as you're not dead, You are still the director of the Federation Bureau of Proclamation. Just like what Lin Banshan said to old Director Tai in the small farmhouse courtyard. Although he had left the Capital Special District, everything he had arranged was still working steadily, and then he dragged the government into the quagmire step by step. After the bloody incident in the capital of South Kazhou, with the cooperation of the Tai family, Lin Banshan secretly succeeded in controlling the news department of the Federation TV station and dealt a heavy blow to the Federation government. After the incident, the relevant agencies of the Federation government began to investigate what went wrong with the news department and why the video that was obviously produced by the Silent March Command could be broadcast through this channel. With the full cooperation of the other major families, the news department of the Federation TV station threw out a few scapegoats, and with the help of the female anchor, it was difficult to avoid this investigation. Up until this very moment, the federal government hadn't even noticed the seemingly unrelated kidnapping cases. The power of the 7 major families was certainly not as strong as the Federation government, especially after the Joint Investigation Department took the Patriot Act and carried out several internal purges, which they would rather be wrong than miss. Their influence in the huge bureaucracy was rapidly weakened, and the officials they could control were getting fewer and fewer. However, after all, these families were terrifying existences that had survived in the shadows for tens of thousands of years. Their branches could shelter them from the wind and rain, and their roots were so deep that no one knew how many kilometers underground. If the Joint Investigation Department and the Patriot Act were like a thunderstorm, no matter how many times they were cut down and purged, there would always be a lot of roots left. In other words, there were still many officials loyal to the 7 major families in the Federation government. Once these officials collectively made a move, it would not be too difficult to cover up for the news department of the Federation TV station. In the news department of the Federation TV station, dozens of staff members were busy with serious and nervous expressions. However, the studio was deathly silent. No one spoke, including the director who was constantly wiping his sweat. Since sleeping with the black horse's head in the villa for a night, the director of the news department had rapidly lost weight. The official in charge of publicity in the official residence had thought that he was under too much psychological pressure because of the report in South Kazhou and had kindly comforted him with a few words. How could they have guessed the real fear in his heart? There were several staff members like the director in the news department. Some of them had huge gambling debts. Some of them went to the brothel only to wake up in the early hours of the morning to find that the girl in their arms was not yet 16 years old, and someone had taken a picture of her. Some of them did not even know where their parents or children had been kidnapped by those terrible mafia until today. The feelings of fear turned into a deathly silence. The director, reporter, cameraman, engineer, and director all knew that there was something wrong with each other, but they did not know what the problem was. They could only do as those people asked and had no choice at all. The director looked at the incomparably lively scene in Parliament Hill on the TV screen and pretended not to hear the phone ringing on his desk because he knew that the call was definitely from the government. After a moment, he glanced uneasily at the electrician in the corner who had lowered his head to do his work. It took a lot of effort for him to swallow his bitter saliva. The person who could decide the content of the news department was no longer him, nor the government, but the electrician who had been hired a few months ago, because this electrician represented the attitude of those people. The staff members inside and outside the studio of the news department suddenly became nervous. Their bodies stiffened as they looked over there. A female editor even almost fainted because they saw that the electrician who had been squatting in the corner suddenly stood up. The electrician hung up the phone in his hand and walked to the window to take a look. He turned back and calmly said to the crowd, "Because the floor is too high, you probably can't hear the noise below. I just want to tell you one thing. You don't have to worry about the government sending military police to arrest you because the Federation TV station building is now surrounded by silent marching troops. They can't enter. Director Brin, we really can't go in. There are at least tens of thousands of people surrounding this place. How can my people go in?" The streets around the Federation TV station building were already occupied by the crowd. Tens of thousands of protesters wearing black masks raised their hands and blocked a dozen black SUVs and even more police cars outside. Beside one of the black SUVs, the deputy director of the Federation Investigation Bureau had an extremely ugly expression. Looking at the sea of people on the streets, he roared into the phone in his hand, "Send a helicopter?" Tens of thousands of people are surrounding this building. Seeing the helicopter land on the roof, they will definitely rush in. When the time comes, will you bear the responsibility, or will I bear the responsibility? You bear the responsibility? Even if you bear the responsibility, you won't dare to give the order. The deputy director hung up the phone angrily. The scene in Parliament Hill appeared on the screens of tens of thousands of households through the Federation News Channel. The Federation government made the quickest response at the first moment. The news channel was the most authoritative and trustworthy media in the Federation society. If the accusations of the Team 7 Major were broadcasted through this media, and in such a shocking manner, then no matter how the government explained, it would be difficult to dispel the suspicion and anger of the public. This had nothing to do with evidence. Just like what a certain Donglin police officer said many years ago, the lives of the ignorant were filled with soap operas provided by the upper class. Therefore, the majority of the Federation's lower-class citizens didn't care whose evidence was stronger. They only believed what they wanted to believe, what they saw with greater visual impact, the so-called truth. The Federation government reacted quickly, but they didn't expect that the young senator seemed to have been prepared. Just as the Federation Investigation Bureau agents and police arrived in front of the news channel building, the place had already become a sea of people. The Silent March Command Center had been moved from the entrance of the George Carlin Art Center to an apartment building 2 kilometers away from the Federal Television Building. The owner of this apartment building was Li Xiaotong. As early as 3 months ago, the 7th young master had sent away all the tenants and secretly moved in the relevant equipment, just waiting for today to be handed over to the young senator. How many TV stations have already started broadcasting the news channel signal? For now, it's still 3. Increase the number to 10 in 2 minutes. The technical department will send out the signal frequency. If there are any problems with the reception of the TV stations, you will be responsible for solving it immediately. Yes. What's the situation on the various online forums? 74% is at the top. Keywords such as the Team 7 incident and Da Vinci have already occupied 6 of the top 10 search rankings. Public Relations Department continue to follow up. Also, the thousands of underground music stations, once the funds are received, ask them to stop selling aphrodisiacs today. All of them will be on the government's dark side. If there isn't enough information, send out the prepared broadcast stories. As for the newspapers, how many are still unwilling to publish? All the entertainment weeklies have already bought out their pages. A few major liberal newspapers have already decided to publish special editions. The problem is that the few newspapers that support the government are still unwilling to agree. Has the contract for the advertising space from Sanlin Bank been faxed? It has been faxed, and it is being reviewed. Especially the Tribune. It was stated in the contract in advance that the advertising content cannot have political content. The top 2 floors of the apartment building had already been hollowed out. Hundreds of silent military headquarters staff were busy with the work at hand, turning the originally extremely empty hall into a tense headquarters. At the desk, in the deepest part of the hall, the tired young senator put his hands on the table. After a moment of silence, he said, "I don't care about the other newspapers, but the Tribune must be taken down. All the pages are blank, and only one sentence is written in special size." The director of the News Relations Department stood behind him and took out a pen to take notes seriously. "We can't talk today." The director looked at the thin body of the senator and hesitated. But this can still be judged by the Tribune editorial board as having political intentions. Add a line of small words below. Samlin United Bank. Practice is more important than commitment. We welcome the purchase of a national fund to support frontline soldiers with practical actions. Lai Ji-yuan turned around and said, "Do you have any other questions about the commercial?" "No questions at all." The director of the News Relations Department praised and left with a smile. From the end of the summer of the 75th year of the constitutional calendar to the beginning of the 76th year of the constitutional calendar, the silent military troop gradually grew. With the successful repeal of the Patriot Act, there were now more than 100,000 people on the streets of the special district of the capital city. In addition to the TV station of the Federation, many people were also heading to the Parliament Hill. But the person who was directing this huge crowd with a clear rhythm and using all kinds of methods to advance step by step to victory was only a tired young senator. Zoe looked at Tai Ziyuan, who was leaning against the desk with his face up and eyes closed. She suddenly realized that there was actually so much strength hidden under this thin body. She slightly frowned and said with emotion, "It's really exciting to witness such a performance with my own eyes." Tai Ziyuan opened his eyes and looked at her with a smile. "This is not a performance." Zoe did not hide her admiration. She sighed and said, "It is indeed not a performance, but a performance. A grand performance called How to Destroy the Federation Government." Tai Ziyuan took the teacup from Bai Chi's hand and took a sip with a frown. The tea was very hot and thick, which was exactly what he needed the most at this time. He put the hot teacup on a book, looked at Zoe, and said with a smile, "If you admire me now, you are also admiring our president. I used to admire him very much, and I have been learning from him." Under the teacup, the title of the thick book was Pabre's Study of the Popular Movement. But you have to admit that this kind of thing always requires talent. Whether it is you or President Pabre, you both have this kind of talent. If it were Su Lu or Lin Banshan, the former might raise his arms and shout loudly, leading 100,000 people directly into the president's official residence, while the latter would probably incite the masses to die together with the government. In the end, he would leave in a carefree manner. Zoe mocked her two absent companions to her heart's content. Tai Ziyuan coughed lightly and said, "Actually, these are just some very complicated affairs. They are not as complicated and difficult as they seem. Just like the siege of the building and the Parliament Hill. If one person can't do it, 10 people won't do it either. Only when there are enough people, so many that there's a huge disparity between them and the enemy, can humans often develop courage. Dripping water can penetrate stone, but it requires tens of thousands or hundreds of millions of water droplets. A stream is clear, but it can only flow calmly. It lacks the power to change the environment. Only when the stream converges into a river and finally into an ocean will it become powerful and fearless. If every drop of water is raised at this time, it will become a roaring wave. And the so-called leader is actually the canal that divides the water." Taizan lowered his gaze slightly and looked at the dark face that was half covered by the teacup on the cover of the book. His responsibility is to guide the water to the place where it is needed. Some water is used for irrigation, some is used to wash away the sand, and some must be forced to overflow. Because only by overflowing can the enemy be stopped from crossing the river. Of course, water is a metaphor. Tai Ziyuan said, "If someone tries to make a real flood to stop the enemy, then I don't know what to say." Leonardo da Vinci broke into the Parliament Hill. Madmanly sent back a video email as proof, the first time in 3 years that the deputy speaker of Xi'an took a tough stance. The news channel broadcasted it live, and the people's movement became more and more intense. For the government of the Federation, this was an unexpected setback and danger. But for those who had been silent for a long time, the blurred faces in the shadow of the Federation, this was the opportunity they had been waiting for, and it might even be the last opportunity. On the terrace of the back mountain, Secretary Shun began to make a call. In the manner of the Southern Minister, Madame Chow began to make a call. On the top floor of the Sanlin United Bank, Li Xiuzhu began to make a call. In the villa of the Ivy Garden, Li Xiaotong began to make a call. Somewhere on the planet S3, Lin Dohai stared at the news channel and roared fiercely at the senator on the phone. "I don't care. I gave you 30 million when I was 16 years old. Why do you think I did that?" Chapter 965. Make things difficult? Make things difficult, my ass. The famous hedonistic son of the Lin family roared furiously into the phone. "Don't blindly trick me. Let me tell you, my big brother is in the Capitol right now. Watch that hand of yours that you use to vote later. Raise it when you should, and don't blindly raise it when you shouldn't. Otherwise, be careful of getting it chopped off." Due to his excessive fear of Sulu, even though the other party had long been confirmed to be a citizen of the Empire, Lin Dohai still only dared to obediently stay on Planet S3. He was sick of seeing the beautiful ladies at the Flowing Fire Festival and eating the local specialty dumplings. Today, even this incompetent, mediocre, and foolish second-generation descendant had begun to take action. Moreover, he was able to find a target he could control in Parliament Mountain. One could only imagine what kind of commotion it would cause when the 7 clans went all out today. Da Vinci's wheelchair was pushed up to the rostrum. Low whispers rose and fell in succession in Parliament Mountain. The staff members ran around with grim expressions. The councillors had shocked and complicated expressions. All of this was because of these calls from the shadows. However, this was not enough. At the very least, it was not enough to determine the direction of Parliament Mountain. After the midterm elections, Pabre's political faction had obtained an enormous voting advantage in Parliament Mountain. It was precisely because of this advantage that the Federation government had continuously passed relevant bills to deal continuous blows to the opposition. If the 7 great clans could control Parliament Mountain, then why would they have remained silent for such a long time? And why would Tai Ziyuan's first impeachment not even pass the first reading of the procedure? The councillors and their companions discussed with their heads lowered. Some of them had nervous expressions, some of them had cold expressions, and some of them had complicated expressions. After a quick calculation, the councillors were stunned to discover that if there were no new changes, the situation on Parliament Mountain would not change because of these calls. Right at this moment, in the Xixia State's governor's office, the governor with a gloomy expression dialed a number and said in a tough tone, "The Pabre and Xi factions are just your words." That's right, Xixia State has always supported His Excellency the President, but from now on, they will no longer support him. Councillor Xiao, you should know very well that without Xixia State support, how could you have been elected as a councillor of the Federation? As Xixia State's representative in the Federation Management Committee, you must faithfully carry out the wishes of the people of your state. How much determination do I have? The governor said in a deep voice. Raise your head and look at the wheelchair on the stage. My son is sitting on it. He is right in front of you. Regarding the National Security Bill, I represent Xixia State to request that you vote against it. No, this was not enough. What could be exchanged for my son's legs? He is such an outstanding young man. When the governor heard Councilman Xiao's question, the bloody picture of his son being chased by the federal forces on the front line of the Mo Hua planet and having his legs blown off by the bomb popped up in his eyes. He roared like an enraged lion. I want you to raise your hands and impeach the goddamn shoe-polish president. In the chairman's office of a large pharmaceutical company in Gongdu, the old former chairman looked at the letter left by his son and then glanced at the TV news. After a moment of silence, he finally dialed the phone and said softly, "Councilman Scree, my old friend, there is something I must trouble you with today. I know this request is a bit excessive, but you should remember that I once told you that my son was once a member of Team 7 in the Army. He is now fighting against the government. If the government wins, only death awaits him. Therefore, I want to use our lifelong friendship to ask for your help." In the Autumn Mountain Villa district, a rich lady with disheveled hair was sitting on the bed, surrounded by messy balls of paper. She shouted into the phone, "If you still insist on your *T political ethics, I will ask my husband to stop all financial support for your office. Your sister-in-law will never get a penny from me again." The lady fiercely wiped away the tears on her face and said hatefully, "Councilman Sun Yu, if this still can't convince you, you can guess what even crazier things a mother who has lost her only son will do." After the first wave of intensive phone attacks on Parliament Hill ended, there was a temporary silence. Just as they were about to proceed to the relevant questioning phase, the phone rang again. This time, It was the neutral councilman and even the pack faction's councilman who had extremely complicated or ugly expressions. Half an hour later, President Pabre was silently watching the voting on Parliament Hill, at this time, in his official residence, when he saw that the Homeland Security Bill did not pass on the first reading. And when he heard the report from his subordinates, he remembered the faint worry he felt when talking to Du Shaoqing. He remembered something from years ago. Through the documentary produced by the Golden Star Documentary Studio, the Federation got to know Team 7. In everyone's impression, Team 7 was a brave, united, and fearless fighting group. Every member was the bravest warrior. However, under the cover of those dazzling deeds, people had long forgotten that not every member of Team 7 was so unparalleled from the beginning. In the 68th year of the Shinli calendar, other than the few old members, the new members of Group 7 from the Harbor City Garrison Guard District did not have the calm and determined temperament that they had now. They were arrogant, weak, and timid. They were completely useless old soldiers, a group of good-for-nothing rich kids. Why? Because the parents of those 100 or so Team 7 members were powerful figures from all over the Federation. Their families always occupied certain positions in the upper echelons of the Federation. Therefore, they themselves were good-for-nothings. Time was like countless gauzes, filtering out many past images, including the government and the military. Everyone only remembered the valiance of the Team 7 members, but they forgot that they had an equally valiant family background. The parents of the members, who had wealth and power in the Federation, naturally did not care about moral responsibility and loyalty. However, as time passed, they began to understand and be proud of the pride of the youth. After constantly receiving news of their son's sacrifice on the front lines, they felt pain and sorrow, but they did not regret it. That was until they discovered the dark shadows behind this matter. Therefore, these local powers, who had originally maintained a neutral position and even faintly leaned towards the government, under the influence of extreme anger, began to act without holding back. Naturally, they were far from being as powerful as the 7 families. However, they and the circles they lived in were the cornerstones of the upper echelons of the Federation. It was a secret network that densely covered countless regions and industries. If one still remembered the 68th year of the constitutional calendar, the movement to save the soldiers that shook Parliament Hill and even silenced the government, one could roughly understand what kind of power the collective anger of this class had. Chapter 966. President Pabre glanced at the message and deleted it expressionlessly. Then he raised his head silently and focused his attention back on a live broadcast of the news on Parliament Hill. The simple sentence in the message revealed too much. He basically understood, but did not care. In the current situation, the gentlewoman who left Bermuda could no longer cause more trouble, and he did not want to investigate further. Would he miss her and complain when he reminisced? Perhaps. That woman was so intelligent, sensible, low-key, gentle, considerate, and considerate. She was worth missing occasionally. However, for the president who had a firm ideal and spent his life fighting to realize it, no matter how gentle a woman was, she was still a woman. She was a flower in the cliff crevice by the mighty river, a striking cinnabar print under a splash ink painting. She had no bearing on the overall situation. Why couldn't the small-eyed special forces and the 3 most elite commandos of the Federation catch Su Lo? You must know that he is not on that weird spaceship right now. I'm very disappointed with your efficiency. President Pabre turned off the communication device and looked at Director Breen beside him. Keep an eye on this matter. Report to me as soon as you have any news. Director Breen nodded and said with a worried face, Mr. President, the most important problem now is still on Parliament Hill. The staff of the President's Academic Foundation, the National Policy and Strategic Research Center, and the think tank have already communicated with the dozens of members of Parliament. But until now, we still don't know why they suddenly changed their voting intention. President Pabre waved his hand tiredly and said, no need. There was a brief silence in the Oval Office of the official residence. The president gently rubbed the space between his eyebrows and quietly looked at the falling snow outside the window. It was as if he was immersed in some distant memories. George Carlin once had a famous saying, which was included in the Green Dragon Mountain anti-government lecture notes. That sentence was, "Not only must justice be done, in order to convince people, it must also be seen." The year I was elected president for the first time, in order to show the people at the bottom who supported me the true justice of the Federation, I ignored the opposition of all the officials, including you, and sent the children of those rich playboys and celebrities to the West Woods, to the front line, and sent them to Suli's subordinates. At the time, Sulu was the successor personally chosen by the war god, and only he helped me realize this wish. But even I did not expect that in such a short time, he could really turn those nobles into true warriors, into his most loyal members. Even though they knew he was a citizen of the empire, those members were still willing to risk their lives for him. President Pabre laughed at himself. He looked at Director Breen and said, "What's boring is that I actually forgot that I did this with my own hands." As a result, their parents dealt a heavy blow to the government at the most critical moment. Director Breen was stunned for a moment before he recalled the incident back then. He finally understood why Parliament Hill was so different today. "Mr. President, the issue that the advisors are very worried about is whether Parliament Hill will use the momentum of rejecting the Homeland Security Act to propose an impeachment." He looked at President Pabre's dark and tired face and said worriedly. Pabre said calmly, "Only half of the votes are needed to reject the bill. The impeachment process is long, and it requires 2/3 of the members to collectively agree to one of the accusations. I don't think those members can complete such a difficult task." The Homeland Security Act was cleanly rejected in the first reading. The members of the Pabre faction, who were obviously not mentally prepared, subconsciously stood up and looked around, as if they wanted to distinguish who voted against the bill. This was the first time since the midterm elections that Parliament Hill successfully rejected a bill proposed by the Pabre government. This scene had not happened for a long time, and it made the members fall into a strange silence. It seemed that everyone was not used to it. The chairman of the Parliament's Judicial Committee, Senator Shao, slowly stood up from his seat and said in a motionless voice, "Based on the accusation of the new 17th Division's Major Da Vinci, as well as the materials submitted by Senator Taguion a few days ago, I suggest restarting the impeachment case against the president. According to the charter, we invite the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, He Ying, to come and preside over the impeachment proceedings." "What did you say? Senator Shao, are you crazy? Please don't abuse your authority and waste the resources of the Federation." Hearing the words of the chairman of the Judicial Committee, the members of the Pabre faction stood up together in anger and waved the digital pens in their hands to express their biggest protest. They stared fiercely at the senior senator from Xixia State, as if they were staring at the most shameful traitor. The quiet and solemn Parliament Hill was attacked by obscenities like a market. One could even clearly hear the sound of shoes knocking on the table and fists tearing through the air. It was chaos. Deputy Speaker Xian didn't seem to hear the fierce protests at all. He lightly knocked on the hard pear board in front of him, gave a slight warning, and said expressionlessly, "Now, we will immediately begin the first reading of the procedure." According to the charter, the Federation Parliament had the right to impeach the president. However, even people who didn't understand the rules could imagine that it would be an extremely difficult process to implement this right. The first step of the standard impeachment process was for the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the Federation to preside over the trial. All members of the Parliament acted as the judges of the impeachment court and listened to the arguments of the prosecution and the testimony of the relevant witnesses. The chairman of the Judicial Committee and the representatives of the sponsors played the role of the prosecution, while the president's official residence had to perform the duty of self-defense. After the trial began, both sides would first make statements for 2 hours and then call the relevant witnesses to testify. After the cross-examination of the witnesses and the end of the debate, the Chief Justice questioned each member of the Parliament in alphabetical order of the impeachment charges. At this time, the parliament members could only answer guilty or not guilty. If more than two-thirds of the parliament members answered guilty to any of the charges, the president would be impeached and replaced by the vice president. The impeached president would not be able to hold any public office for the rest of his life. If he committed a criminal offense, he would be tried by a normal court after he regained his civilian status. Note, before these processes, the Parliament Hill had to first pass the impeachment proposal of the Judicial Committee through a third reading. Although only half of the Parliament members were required to pass, it was often the most intense process of debate and all kinds of procedural issues. From this, it was clear that the Parliament Hill had a long and torturous process from the introduction of the impeachment proposal to the official start of the debate in the Court of Charges to the final result. When Speaker Zion announced the start of the preliminary process of voting, there was a commotion in the Parliament Hill. The Parliament members of various factions stood up and attacked each other. Some tried to delay the process by using this method, while others mocked each other for being as childish as children. The Parliament members were all immersed in the battle that was like a warm-up in a boxing ring. The staff in the Parliament members' offices had already started to act. They kept making phone calls to purchase daily necessities, including toiletries, and asked the Parliament members' personal assistants to immediately bring the bedding that the Parliament members were most comfortable with. The most experienced members of the Parliament's office immediately informed the Parliament members' favorite restaurants to prepare the ingredients for takeout. At the top of the rostrum, Deputy Speaker Zion's eyelids drooped as he said softly, "Dear Parliament members, please make as much noise as you want. But I would like to remind you not to leave the Parliament Hill. Any attempt to cause a lack of votes by not being present is not possible today." Deputy Speaker Zion slowly raised his head and looked at the Parliament members of the PAC faction who had anxious and embarrassed expressions. He said, "Even if you can bribe the guards, I would like to know how you are going to bribe the tens of thousands of Federation citizens outside. A tempting game would always attract playful children to stay up all night and devote themselves to it. And this game on the Parliament Hill that might change history would definitely force the Parliament members who were physically weak to stay up all night and devote themselves to it, whether due to old age, lust, alcohol, or other reasons. If nothing unexpected happened, this would definitely be the longest Parliament debate and vote in the history of the Federation. Before a certain Parliament member said yes or no, no one would know what the final result would be. The entire Federation, including the Empire of the Left Sky Star region, was paying attention to the Parliament Hill. Everyone wanted to know the ending of this great show. However, there were some people who knew very well that the so-called ending would definitely not happen here, such as Su Lo. Group 7, who directly and indirectly caused the current tense situation in the Federation, disappeared without a trace after completing the surprise attack on the Spring City Sanatorium. There were no traces of them on any news media, and only a few people knew that in the past night, the Federation's secret special forces had engaged in many life-or-death battles with them. A black car without any markings drove at high speed through the steep mountain road. Neither the slopes nor the dangerous sharp turns seemed to be able to slow down this black car in the slightest. The hard tires made a loud, grinding sound against the dirt as it rushed forward, carrying wind and dust with it. It seemed to be even more powerful than the highest grade of off-road vehicles. After confirming through the car's radar screen that the 3 armed helicopters had been shaken off, Lu Jiao suddenly turned the steering wheel and accurately parked the black car in the pine forest on the side of the road. He took off his hat and wiped his face. "Boss, where do we go next?" he asked. Su Lu in the back seat did not immediately answer his question. He picked up the car's encrypted phone, wedged it into a certain frequency, and asked in a low voice, "Big Bear, how is the situation on your side?" No one answered. Su Li's brows furrowed. Although the glory of a charter was currently unable to threaten Group 7's operations, this was still the hinterland of the Federation. Countless powerful government agencies were dispatched at the same time. Not long after he brushed shoulders with Zhang Xiaohua in that convenience store, he was targeted. For the past day and night, he had been dealing with those fierce special forces. If it wasn't for this black car, and if it wasn't for Lu Jiao driving, perhaps he would have been surrounded by them more than 10 hours ago. At this time, Xiong Linqiuan's panting voice finally sounded in the communication frequency. "We are retreating. Iron 7 Division is a bunch of trash. I wish I could put the infrared sensor on the mother of Asterisk King Old Moon. We've been discovered. I repeat, we are retreating." Sulu narrowed his eyes. Although Du Xiaoqing was now the commander of the Federation, Iron 7 Division was still the terrifying Iron 7 Division for back then. "Everyone retreat." He did not hesitate to give the order and quickly said, "Don't leave any Hawkeye. Pay attention, don't leave a single one." He believed that in the current situation, Iron 7 Division would definitely not leave the garrison area to pursue. He then asked, "Yin Bingyan, how are things on your side?" A moment later, a rough voice sounded in the communication frequency. "Boss, the three of us are circling around the Snow Leopard assault team. Those bastards aren't very good, but their equipment is 2F Asterisk King advanced. We can't hold on for much longer." Sulu reached out and pulled up the electronic map in the car. He looked at a certain light spot on the map and said, "Go straight at full speed from your coordinates at West 32. You must get out before they encircle you. Get on the train at Taikong and take the high-speed rail to the Golden Fleeting nightclub in the capital of Neng State. There will be people there to meet you." After a pause, he said, "As long as you walk into the nightclub alive, you will have completed your mission. Thank you for your hard work." 170 kilometers south of the capital was the Iron 7 Division's newest garrison camp. Opposite the military camp was the continuous Chiu Fu mountain range. The mountain range was not high in this area. It gradually extended to the periphery of Philadelphia and suddenly became a dangerous peak covered with snow. The black car was like a ghost parked in a dense forest in the depths of the mountain ridge. Sulu carried a black box and a heavy military backpack as he walked out of the car. He hugged Lu Jiao tightly and then parted ways. It took him nearly 2 hours to find a path that no one had ever taken before from the steepest cliff. He quietly hid himself at the highest peak of the mountain opposite the military camp. Behind a gray stone on the mountain peak, Sulu mobilized the scorching power behind his waist and slowly closed his eyes. He recalled the feeling when he was tens of millions of tons underwater on the Imperial spaceship and let the threads of true chi seep into every cell of his body. The ticking of the second hand moved. His breathing gradually slowed down as time passed. His heartbeat dropped to less than 16 beats per minute. His body temperature also became lower and lower. The Iron 7 Division's military philosophy was strict and meticulous. In addition to the observation posts stipulated by regulations, there were many infrared detectors hidden in the forest around the military camp. But at this time, the infrared detectors that found Xiong Linqiuan and the other team members could no longer find Su Lu outside the big rock on the mountain peak, because in the infrared imaging, Su Li's body had become a real rock at this time. The heavy black box was opened. The ACW was quickly assembled. The hollow barrel poked out of the crack of the rock. The original tungsten alloy tail, fin, large caliber bullets had been loaded. Sula half landed the big rock. He tried to control the rhythm of his body to prevent his body temperature from rising. He gently turned the red touch button with his right thumb. As the touch button moved, the miniature hologram of the ACW showed the image of the Iron 7 Division's camp at the foot of the mountain. The high magnification equipment clearly showed the resolute expressions of the Iron 7 Division soldiers, the rows of barracks, and the military MX mecha group that were still training in the middle of the night. Smoke was rising gradually. Sula looked at the constantly changing images on the hologram and saw Willow Mubai faintly appear in the distance. He found that the first ray of morning light had fallen on his body uninvited. He couldn't help but squint his eyes. Many years ago, he had controlled the MX Mecha to half-crouch on the mountain peak during the Japanese graduation performance, bathing in the morning light and overlooking the Iron 7 Division's camp. At that time, his opponent was the Iron 7 Division's defense battalion. What he had to do was to find a battalion headquarters and defeat Shimanjin. And today, his opponent was the entire Iron 7 Division. What he had to do was find Du Shaoqing and kill him. Note, these 200 words are copied from the US. I want to explain it to everyone. Also, my mood today is really bad. If there's anything that isn't solid in the writing, please understand. But this has nothing to do with whether the plot is high or not. I said before that spies will definitely be solid and happy in the end. I especially pay attention to the latter. But everyone's high point is different. This can't be fully satisfied. For example, when I wrote the second chapter yesterday, I was pretty high, but it seems that some of my friends didn't like to read it. Chapter 9, 67. It was the same military camp on Sunrise Peak, but the enemy was even more powerful and unshakable. Because of the strict control of the Federation, his comrades in the Federation couldn't provide him with a mecha. He only had an ACW. The front of the thick barrel didn't have a silencer installed because he believed that Du Shaoqing would only leave him a chance to fire one shot. As long as the shot occurred, the well-trained subordinates of the Iron 7th Division would definitely find the sniping spot immediately. Then, the mecha swarms would cover the entire mountain. Since that was the case, there was no need to install a silencer. Without a silencer, he could maximize the armor-piercing and magnetic properties of the original tungsten tail shell to ensure the success rate of the first shot. Lying under the boulder and looking up at the dark gray sky, Su Lu found that the glimmer of dawn that had just appeared quickly dimmed again. Dark clouds slowly squeezed in from the north and covered the sky again. The wind gradually picked up, dimming the light. A person from the Empire, coming to the Federation after tens of thousands of years. What kind of mental illness is this? The corners of his lips curled up slightly in a self-deprecating smile. He silently asked himself the question that he had asked many times, but he couldn't find the answer. The success rate of killing Du Shaoqing was very low. Even if it was successful, a famous Federation general who was deeply loved by the Federation people would die in the hands of the Empire's prince. No one knew what kind of chaos and turmoil it would cause. If he had a choice, Su Lu definitely wouldn't have come to the Iron 7th Division's camp. If the Senate passed the impeachment, President Pabre would be willing to accept this ending and step down peacefully. This would naturally be the best development of the story. However, he understood Pabre because they were both stubborn and persevering stones. He also understood Li Jiedu because he knew that the brilliance of the Lees of Philadelphia was enough to distort many people's thinking and judgment. Therefore, Su Lu knew very well that there were no ifs in this story. He had no other choice. Pabre and Li Jiedu definitely wouldn't admit defeat, and when they began to mobilize the terrifying power of the army, no one, including himself, could stop all of this. He could only choose to kill the most dangerous and most powerful Du Shaoqing, then continue to try to kill the other two. Li Zidao held a cup of tea and slowly sipped it. As the leader of the military and the highest leader of the Joint Investigation Department, he had been very calm over the past few days. Marching into the capital city in silence, Group 7's assault on the Spring Capital Sanatorium, the nullification of the Patriot Act by the Supreme Court, and the impeachment case that was being debated fiercely on Parliament Hill right now, none of them could change the expression on his face or make the tea in his cup thicker. The Federation was in a precarious situation and was about to make a big move, but he was still as calm as a mountain. He was as calm as usual in the Joint Conference building. Occasionally, he would care about the information of Team 7, but he didn't seem to care much about it. It was as if it was not important to him whether or not he could catch Su Lu in Team 7. Is there any letter from Feng? He turned around and put down the teacup, asking slowly. The secretary hurriedly moved his gaze away from the general's white hair and replied softly, "I'm sorry, General. Colonel Li Feng didn't send any letters." All the officers felt that the general's behavior was a little strange. They couldn't understand how he could be so calm and confident in such a situation. Only a few of his closest subordinates vaguely understood something when they thought of the war between Su Lu and the Federation more than 3 years ago. At that time, Li Jiedu was as calm as he was now when he faced the invincible Su Lu, who had the first sequence of the charter. After that, The changes in the charter computer that no one knew about proved that his calmness came from his strong confidence in his wisdom and methods. It came from the trump card that no one could think of. Lee Jae-do looked at the slowly swirling tea leaves in the cup and remembered that when he was a child, his father would often use 8 rice shinshi to shake the tea in the cup and try to use this method to make him happy when he returned home from the front lines. At that time, he was indeed very happy when he was still a little boy. However, as he gradually grew up and realized that he couldn't have the magical ability that his father had, he could no longer be happy. As he got married and had children and found that his son had this ability, Lee Jae-do's complex emotions reached a peak. Then he silently buried his childhood desire and sadness in the depths of his heart and never mentioned it to anyone. "Father, your ability can make the tea swirl, but I don't envy you anymore, and I don't envy Fonger anymore, because I have found an extremely powerful force, so powerful that it can make the stars swirl." Lee Jae-do said silently in his heart, and then dialed the official residence's phone number. "Mr. President, I think that we must make a decision now. General, this decision is not easy to make. Our names will be recorded in history books. Mr. President, history is written by the victors, running into an unknown future at the risk of a civil war. If you're worried about the outcome of these 2 wars, I assure you that we will definitely win the final victory." President Pabre was silent for a long time on the other end of the phone, and then he replied in a tired voice, "General, wait a little longer." Deep in the alley opposite the General Staff Association's office building, there was a famous Bermuda-style restaurant, famous for its salted pig legs and black beer. Beside the green table on the balcony, Magnolia slowly chewed on the sausages and bread. Her eyes looked out from under the brim of her hat and looked at the building in the distance, full of doubts and uneasiness. In the distant asteroid belt, in the cabin of the black, broken spaceship, the slender mechanical arm was shaking non-stop as it mumbled to itself like a drunk woman. "Bad bomb. Where are you? Where are you?" The huge 2-dimensional light beam chessboard was full of black and white chess pieces. The battle with the piece of scrap metal under the Bureau of Proclamation continued to the point where the chessboard was almost full, and Philip was already beginning to feel the strain. For him, the more important problem now was to find the possible bad bombs. From the calculation and analysis of the clues in the BG Plateau until now, he still hadn't found any suspicious traces. Biderman, with a head of messy and dirty hair, looked thinner than a few days ago. He stared like a madman with pale eyes, drank his coffee mechanically, and asked, "You won't tell me what you were looking for. I can't help you. This is the core program. I can't tell you," Philip replied. "The problem is, I don't have a database now, and I can't find any historical materials, which means I have no experience. How can I find it?" In the 76th year of the constitutional calendar, the political situation of the Federation was in turmoil. Hundreds of thousands of silent demonstrators flooded the capital. Although these demonstrators tried their best to maintain good order, the large number of people still greatly affected the traffic and public security in many areas of the capital. Fortunately, like most of the 10 billion people in the Federation, the citizens of the capital basically stayed at home for the past 2 days. They held their bowls of noodles, smoked cigarettes, and drank beer. They were either nervous, excited, or bored, attracted by the live broadcast on the news channel, so the social order didn't become more chaotic. The live broadcast on Parliament Hill entered the drama of the impeachment of President Chung. All the TV stations began to broadcast it live, so some political nihilists found that the remote control was basically useless and angrily smashed the TV screen. At this time, the Federation News Channel suddenly showed a window in the upper right corner of the live broadcast on Parliament Hill. In the window, the host announced the latest news. The State Assembly of Xixia State passed a resolution, and the governor angrily announced on TV that because of the president's shameless behavior, Xixia State would no longer support the current Federation government. Immediately after, S2 State Oak State announced the same content. Then it was a two-state ring state that surrounded the mountain and the other three states. In the midst of the fierce debate on Parliament Hill to start the impeachment process, a total of 17 state assemblies of the Federation passed resolutions to declare that they didn't believe in Pabre's government and asked the president to resign immediately. At this time, except for the West Woods region and Green Dragon Mountain who opposed the government, the political forces of the Federation clearly showed their positions. The states of the East Woods region naturally chose to support Pabre's government. But unfortunately, like many years before, this abandoned planet was easily forgotten. Not many people knew that Zhang Xiaoming had left the capital special district early and returned to Green Dragon Mountain. In front of the bed, she clearly explained her views to the leader of Nanshui. In the dim room, the leader of Nanshui looked at her with a face full of age spots. His eyes showed the wisdom and inexplicable smile that was unique to old people. Before she left, the old man muttered in a low voice, "Radical revisionism is not good." The next day, the Central Committee of Green Dragon Mountain issued a notice to all citizens of the Federation through the Capital Special District Daily. In the notice to all citizens, Green Dragon Mountain asked for a thorough investigation of the explosion of the ancient bell case, for the president to resign and be put on trial, for the people to unite and send Li Jiedu and the other warmongers to the Qingqing military prison, and for the appropriate time to use force to protect the true spirit of the Charter. On the same day, a mechanic from the West Woods region of the Federation entered the capital of Sunset State and surrounded the Venus Hotel where the Department of National Defense Liaison Office was located. Another rapid response brigade parachuted into the Changfeng military base and seized control without firing a shot. 11 senior officers of the Department of National Defense and more than 30 relatives of the Zhong family were declared as unwelcome people in the West Woods. They were escorted to the spaceship by the fully armed Zhong family troops and exiled back to the capital ring through the Changfeng military base. The troops loyal to the Federation government began to quickly gather and prepare for war. The fastest mecha troop approached the capital of Sunset State in the evening. A civil war seemed to be about to begin. The situation in the West Woods suddenly worsened, and the atmosphere was so tense that it was suffocating. At this time, the little princess of the Zhong family, who was fanatically supported by the people of the West Woods, walked out of the old house in Weitu district under the setting sun. In front of the Red Oil restaurant, Zhong Wanhua looked at the camera in front of her, narrowed her moon-like eyes, and said calmly with a smile, "Regarding the explosion of the ancient bell, regarding the death of my parents and the soldiers of the West Woods, if the Federation does not give the West Woods an explanation, then the West Woods will give the Federation an explanation." Chapter 968. Standing next to Zhong Huiyan was the expressionless Mr. Tian. Both of them were wearing ordinary civilian clothes. Behind them were dozens of West Woods military officers in well-ironed Federation uniforms. The commander of the 7th Brigade, Zhou Jin, walked to the front of the formation and saluted with a bang. Then he left, followed by the burly commander of the local defense camp, Wang Ming. These Silan soldiers, who had sworn to protect the Zhong family with their lives and blood, received their orders and left in front of the eyes of the entire Federation. Many years ago, one of the ancestors of the Zhong family in the West Woods had left a famous quote for the Federation: "The Federation does not attack the Federation's people." However, the attitude that the West Woods military forces showed to the entire Federation today seemed to be the complete opposite of that quote. Would the first civil war in the Federation begin? Would the West Woods, which had been neither close nor distant to the capital ring for thousands of years, declare independence in defiance of the Charter? If it was an old man with a gloomy expression who led Silan's native forces to issue the strongest voice against the capital ring, the Federation society and media would immediately begin condemning him in speech and in writing. They would label him as a maniacal, ambitious schemer and a bloodthirsty schemer. However, the one who appeared in front of the entire universe was an orphan girl whose parents were both dead. Most people began to believe that the explosion of the ancient bell was a conspiracy of the federal government. In the face of this pitiful orphan girl who had no one to rely on, it was difficult for anyone to associate her with an ambitious schemer. No one could blame her in the name of morality. On the contrary, the people sympathized with her and pitied her. Therefore, after the West Woods Declaration was made, anti-government protests spread throughout the Federation. There were two more demands: to oppose the Civil War and to ask the government to give justice to the West Woods. The governor of Xixia State arrived at the capital special district in a special vehicle. He unfurled a very long light screen banner in Charter Square and then was arrested for violating the Traffic Act. The governor did not resist at all because this was his plan. He believed that when the people of Xixia State saw the image of him being handcuffed, more people would leave their apartment buildings and walk on the streets. In order to deal with the situation in the West Woods and the increasingly tense atmosphere, the 3rd Military Region stationed at S3 started to prepare for war. However, when a mecha operator requested the Duck Mountain Assembly Base to distribute the relevant components, he didn't get a response. The Duck Mountain Assembly Base was the largest logistics base of the Federation. The garrison of the base raised their alert level. The 2 heavy alloy doors slowly closed. Countless heavy firepower groups were ready to fire at any time. In the conference room of the base, several generals of the Federation rejected the 4th transfer request of the 3rd Military Region without hesitation. In the dim front desk, the idle general who was relieved of his post as Minister of Defense 3 years ago and sent to the General Assembly Base turned around and looked at his loyal subordinates. It's true that the military shouldn't have its own thoughts, but with the Constitution, the Federation forces don't fight civil wars. Right now, the Federation is already in a precarious situation. Do we need the help of a person from the Empire to get back on the right track? As a soldier of the Federation, I can't afford to lose face like this. We must save ourselves. As the anti-government forces in Green Dragon Mountain and the Zhong family in the West Woods expressed their unyielding stance, the terrifying shadow of the Civil War spread like lead clouds in the sky. The invisible and powerful pressure caused many people to silently change their attitude. Many of the loyal people who supported the government had become silent. The remaining forces of Pable in the 3 major unions in the 4 states were no longer as passionate and aggressive as they were a few days ago. Some members of Parliament had also begun to think about the future. After a night of intense debate, the bargaining and the procedures finally ended. After 3 procedural votes, they officially entered the impeachment process. When they saw the images on the news, the silent citizens who were waiting in front of the Federation TV station in front of Parliament Hill burst into the most excited cheers and screams. In stark contrast, the president's official residence was silent in the snow. This wasn't the first time President Pabre was impeached, but the impeachment proposal proposed by Tai Ziyuan didn't even pass the first reading before it ended miserably. Who would have thought that today's impeachment would actually enter the final stage? The staff in the president's official residence had complicated expressions. They felt that the snow outside the window seemed to have defeated the temperature control system in the room, and the surrounding environment suddenly became cold. The evidence is still being submitted. After a while, the prosecution and defense will have 2 hours of self-defense time. The defense lawyer and the relevant personnel of the Ministry of Justice have already arranged it. In the Oval Office, Director Breen looked at the president by the window with a tense expression. His voice became a little hoarse and uneasy. According to the research of the Foundation, the Research Lab, and the think tank, as well as the attitude of the senators obtained from the return calls, we now have 41% of the votes in our hands. Theoretically, the impeachment proposal has no chance of passing. In the end, all stories have nothing to do with probability. Things that are theoretically impossible often become the most real harm in the end. President Pabre replied, then raised his arm and motioned for Director Breen to leave. There was no one in the Oval Office. The president poured a glass of wine, sat on the sofa by the window, and slowly sipped it. He lit a cigarette and looked at the snow and lead clouds outside the window in silence for a long time. He was the son of a miner in Donglin who was extremely lucky to come to the capital ring. Then he became a lawyer, a public interest lawyer, a poor lawyer, a stupid lawyer who almost couldn't practice anymore. Then he became a lawyer consultant for the three major unions, the darling of the liberal media, a breeze in the political circle of the Federation, and finally the most powerful man in the Federation. The turning point of this legendary life was when he got drunk in a small tavern. Since then, Pabre rarely drank and never smoked a cigarette again. You once had nothing, so what right do you have to be depressed today? Do you want to watch the Federation be led into the abyss of despair by corrupt politicians, greedy families, and soldiers who don't hesitate to fight a civil war? No, Pabre, you have to stand up. It's time for you to make a decision. The dark-faced man stood up and stared coldly at the snow outside the window. Suddenly, he slammed the wine glass to the ground and turned around. The First Lady stood silently by the door. Her eyes moved from the glass pieces on the ground to his face. Her eyes were full of worry, uneasiness, and a touch of sadness and loss. I'm not doing this for myself, nor for power. I'm doing this for the Federation. You should know how much I love this Federation. President Pabre pursed his lips in pain. Facing his wife's gaze, he walked to the desk, picked up the phone, and dialed the few numbers he needed to dial. The thick clouds of snow were heavy, but they still couldn't completely block out the sunlight coming from the atmosphere. The morning light had already become bright. It was because the light was everywhere that people often forgot about its existence. Sulu, whose body was stiff, quietly lay under a huge rock like a stone man. Through the miniature light screen next to his face, he monitored the movements of the military camp on the other side of the mountain. After observing for a long time on the mountain peak, he still couldn't find Du Shaoqing's barracks. In fact, because the distance was too far, he had to wait until Du Shaoqing walked out of the barracks if he wanted to kill him. Suddenly, his pupils contracted. His heartbeat, which was forcibly suppressed by true qi, started to beat rapidly at this moment. Then, it returned to normal. On the other side of the mountain, there was some movement in the barracks of the Iron 7th Division. From the outside, the layers of barracks and the statue-like mechas covered in rainproof cloth didn't seem to have changed at all. The only difference was that the right foundation valve of the warehouse on the west side was opened. At the same time, the people in the logistics barracks seemed to be moving more densely. Sulu had been in the federal forces for too long. He knew that the right foundation valve was open to clear the water needed by the energy injection equipment in the warehouse. The fact that the logistics barracks were moving so densely meant that this wasn't a routine action. The energy injection equipment in the warehouse was under the ground. It was responsible for replenishing the energy of the military mechas. Through these details, he immediately determined that the Iron 7th Division was preparing for battle. The situation he didn't want to face the most was finally unavoidable. Sure enough, countless low, buzzing sounds of mecha self-checks rang out in the barracks of the Iron 7th Division. These sounds gathered together and became incomparably dull and shocking. Sulu narrowed his eyes and stared at the image on the miniature screen. A moment later, he saw more than 100 black military MX mechas lined up at high speed like 100 austere gods. Then, they drove out of the barracks in 3 different directions. He noticed that the Iron 7th Division's mechas were extremely cautious and maintained their formation. Meanwhile, the mechas closest to the mountain quickly spread out to expand the surveillance area. Suli's pupils shrank, and his body stiffened even more. The MX Mecha's SCC global surveillance system was designed by Shang Qiu. Even if he closed his eyes, he could calculate how wide an area the Iron 7th Division's mechas could monitor. This area was just a few meters below the giant rock, which meant that he couldn't get any closer to the road. More than a dozen dark green bulletproof military vehicles slowly drove out of the barracks of the Iron 7th Division. Sulu stared at one of the vehicles in the middle. He stared at the face that was still blurry under the ACW's terrifying aiming magnifier. It was as if he could see that pair of sunglasses and that cold expression that had been on that face for thousands of years. Du Shaoqing was definitely in that vehicle. The problem was that the giant rock was too far away from the road. It was beyond the effective shooting range of the ACW. And if Su Lu tried to sneak down and get closer, he would definitely alert the dozen or so powerful mechas at the base of the mountain. This was the Iron 7th Division's mecha formation. It looked like a mediocre mecha formation, but it provided perfect protection for the core area. Su Lu firmly believed that with the terrifying military discipline of the Iron 7th Division, there would be no gaps in the enemy's mecha formation during the 170-kilometer journey to the capital's special district. Su Lu licked his lips as he watched the heavy mechas spread out and silently escort the convoy onto the road. He couldn't help but wonder if the enemy had noticed something. Right now, he was faced with a difficult choice. If he was just a cold-blooded killer, he would definitely choose to pick up the ACW and quietly retreat. Then he would wait for a better opportunity to shoot. But he wasn't a killer. What he needed to do was to stop Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7th Division from entering the capital. He couldn't wait any longer. Just then, the phone in his pocket suddenly vibrated. Chapter 969. The Iron 7th Division started moving towards the capital city. Almost at the same time, the Federation also started gathering their troops. The 4 special class operators from the capital city garrison left their stations and silently guarded the city. The 1st Guard Regiment's Mecha Battalion headed straight for the back of Macho Mountain. After years of Li Jiedu's deployment, the capital city of the Federation was now surrounded by strong and sturdy metal walls. These troops that were absolutely loyal to President Pabre were the Federation's strongest source of power. Non-wartime deployment wasn't authorized by Parliament Hill, approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and signed by the Minister of Defense. It was a direct order from the President's official residence. The procedure was clearly unconstitutional. According to the relevant regulations of the Federation's Constitution, the Bureau of Proclamation, as the highest-ranking enforcer of the Federation's Constitution, should be able to quickly and forcefully take countermeasures against this kind of blatant violation of the Constitution. On a certain day, at the beginning of the 76th year of the Constitution, the Bureau of Proclamation's Constitution computer in the basement of the Bureau of Proclamation's building immediately sent out an alarm. The entire Bureau of Proclamation's building instantly rang with a sharp alarm. However, in the face of this serious incident, the Bureau of Proclamation's director, Cui Zhedong, stood beside the stairs with a serious expression. He didn't make any reaction. He even forcefully suppressed the anxious questions of some of the workers. Under the Bureau of Proclamation's tacit approval or connivance, the Federation forces controlled the 3 main roads in the capital city in a very short amount of time. The 1st Guard Regiment's Mecha Battalion from the capital city garrison used their fastest speed to invade the beautiful back of Macho Mountain. In front of the locked iron gate of the manor, hundreds of fully armed soldiers appeared. In the picturesque scenery by the lake, there were also dozens of black MX mechas. In the capital's special district, in the largest city of the Federation, and in many state capitals, the Joint Investigation Department, which was facing the pressure of being downsized, burst into unprecedented action. The powerful, small-eyed special forces rushed into countless buildings with arrest warrants faxed by the Ministry of Justice and began to make arrests. 2 black armed helicopters roared and landed on the roof of the 3rd Forest United Bank's headquarters. Under the black rope, the elite Small Eyes Special Forces swung in from outside the building and smashed through the huge floor-to-ceiling glass, breaking into the building. Among the glass shards on the floor, more than 10 masked Special Forces members aimed at the young CEO behind the table. Under the accompaniment of the terrified screams of the bank's secretaries and workers, one of the members shouted, "Li Xiuzhu, put your hands up!" The CEO behind the table frowned slightly. "Mr. Li Xiuzhu, because you are suspected of manipulating the stock market, concealing relevant earnings, violating the Financial Compliance Act, and violently resisting the government's investigation, the Federal Ministry of Justice announces your arrest." The CEO took out the arrest warrant, Li Xiuzhu, and then took out handcuffs and was ready to arrest him. The new CEO of the Sanlin United Bank looked at the soldier in front of him. His brows slightly furrowed, and his expression was extremely cold as he spoke in a deep voice. "I'm not Li Xiaozhu. My name is Li Xiaotong." The small-eyes Special Forces members around were stunned. They pulled up the electronic information to confirm that the CEO behind the table was not Li Xiaozhu. However, the leader of the Special Forces looked at Li Xiaodong and said sympathetically, "If I were you, I would rather be Li Xiaozhu." Then he took out another arrest warrant and said in a deep voice, "Mr. Li Xiaotong, you are suspected of selling information to the Empire and conspiring with the Empire's spy, He Yu to murder General Zhong Su of the Federation. You will be tried by the Federation Military Court." Li Xiaodong looked at the arrest warrant issued by the Ministry of Defense and frowned slightly. After a moment of silence, he sighed and then stretched out his hands. Such a scene happened in many places in the Federation. Just like Li Xiaotong, the big shots of those families, no matter where they hid, would always be found by the small-eyes Special Forces and arrested for various reasons. The 7 great families, who had been hiding in the shadows of the Federation for countless years, possessed strength and connections that ordinary people could not imagine. However, at this moment, in the face of the terrifying and unreasonable offensive of the Federation government, they were still being defeated one after another. Because this was the first time in the history of the Federation that the President's office, the military, and the Bureau of Proclamation had launched an attack on the 7 families at the same time. Under the attack of the holy and terrifying Trinity, the 7 families that had lasted for tens of thousands of years were already on the verge of collapse. It seemed that they were about to see the scene of the abyss of death. At this time, Su, who was hiding in the rock peak and watching the scenery of Ironsure's battle, received a call from the lady in the back mountain of Macho. Sula knew why Lady Tai knew how to contact him. He only knew that no matter where he was, she could find him. "I want you to delay Du Shaoqing, at least until the Parliament passes the impeachment." Lady Tai said this indifferently on the phone and then hung up. Su Lu was left stunned and speechless as he stared at the bottom of the mountain in a daze. Below the mountain was an entire division, the Federation's strongest Iron 7th Division. More than 100 terrifying military MX mechas were scattered across the field. Behind the dozen or so military vehicles, hundreds of armored vehicles were rushing over. He only had 1 person and 1 gun. "Should I thank you for your ridiculous trust in me?" The moment Sulu closed his eyes, he sent the most respectful greetings to the lady in his mind. Then he suddenly turned around, picked up the heavy ACW, and jumped onto the rock under the sun. He aimed at the military vehicle on the road below the mountain. Without any hesitation, he stood on the rock and used the most standard horizontal shooting position. He narrowed his eyes and pulled the trigger at the military vehicle in the distance. On the balcony behind Macho Mountain, Lady Tai sat silently at the table. She looked at the calm winter lake in front of her. She looked at the floating ice shards on the lake and the snowy forest on the opposite shore reflected by the ice shards. "Are you nervous?" she suddenly asked. Butler Jean noticed that the lady hadn't drunk the tea in front of her. He slowly walked up to her and replaced her cup. He didn't answer the question because he knew that the lady was asking about someone else. Secretary Shun stood behind the lady. After a moment of silence, he replied, "I am indeed a little nervous. The capital ring is so unstable and dangerous. It's really hard to imagine." Lady Tai gently pinched the slightly hot ear of the cup. She smiled and said, "That's because you're too young. Or rather, you haven't had the opportunity to come into contact with the real history outside of history textbooks. Since the end of the Republic, who knows how many situations like this have happened in the history of the Three Forest Galaxy. The war between the government and the 7 great families didn't just start today, and it's also impossible for it to end today in such a crude and simple way." The lady looked at the winter forest on the opposite side of the lake and said calmly, "Countless of our ancestors died tragically in military prisons. Several presidents also died in pools of blood due to assassination attempts. It wasn't until later that everyone realized that there was no benefit in continuing this war that they chose to coexist." She continued expressionlessly, Mr. President is similar to young people like you. He's not willing to learn more about history. After all, the Lee J-Do family's history is too short, so they can't understand that everything has a reason to exist. After saying this, Lady Tai looked at Shun-Li and said with a smile, "As the most humiliating character in the Trinity Association, they thought that they would know my bottom line and all the trump cards of the 7 great families through you. That's why they dared to use such a crude and rude method. However, they didn't expect that through you, I would be able to see their every move clearly. I know who their supporters in the Senate are, but they don't know anything. Madam, you're very far-sighted." Secretary Shun had followed Lady Tai for almost 10 years, so he didn't think that his words were flattering. He frowned and said in a low voice, "But since you knew beforehand that the government would use the military, why did you insist on not leaving? The reason why these 1,000-year-old families were able to survive in the Federation is not only because they have too many resources, but also because these families have their own persistence and sense of glory. That's why I believe that no matter if it's the Li family or the Nan Xiang family, when faced with the arrest of the federal forces, they definitely wouldn't run away. At least, they would leave behind a few people with enough weight to maintain their own glory." Lady Tai smiled and said, "As a descendant of the imperial family, the Tai family doesn't have the right to run away. If they were scared and ran to Bermuda, this war might have ended a few thousand years ago. But it's still too risky." Secretary Shun looked at the forest on the opposite side of the lake. Lady Tai looked at the vague silhouettes of mechas in the forest and said with a mocking smile, "Since you already knew that the one in charge of attacking this area was the Mecha Battalion of the 1st Regiment, then what danger is there? Or perhaps you should call the president now and ask him why this military unit hasn't attacked yet. Instead, those mechas are guarding Macho's back mountain." Secretary Shun looked in shock at the dozen or so black mechas patrolling the forest. He finally understood where his madam's calmness came from. Feiqing's military god had suppressed the 7 great families for decades, but in the end, he still hadn't completely succeeded. His right hand trembled slightly, and it was difficult for him to take out his phone. The Federation government launched its final attack on the 7 great families. Those families that had been silent for 3 whole years finally began to bare their sharp fangs. In the middle of a heated debate on Parliament Hill, a hardcore supporter of President Pabre suddenly asked to speak. This representative used the most unyielding attitude to attack the president and the government. Before the impeachment vote had even started, he passionately declared that he would definitely vote in favor of the impeachment vote. The hall was in an uproar. What happened next caused the entire Federation to be in an uproar. The Tai families Xiao Shu Foundation and Samlin United Bank joined forces and officially announced the full privatization of the Shell Motor Company. There is a saying in the Federation, where there is metal, there is the mark of Shell Motor Company. This company had invented the Jingnong battery and the crystal engine. It had a long history and had a close relationship with the federal military. Now, most of the MX mechas and close to half of the battleships in the Federation were produced by this company. A more direct explanation was that Shell Motor Company was the Federation's biggest and most important company. Chapter 970. No one knew who the owner of the Shell Motor Company was, because the ownership structure of this giant company was very complicated. At the beginning of the Republic, 30% of the shares belonged to the Federation Citizen Fund. Nominally, the power was exercised by the Parliament, but in reality, it was directly controlled by the government. The rest of the shares were made up of countless public funds and private funds. Among them, the second largest shareholder after the Federation government was the Veterans Association, but it only held 1% of the shares. It was related to the lifeline of the Federation, so it was unacceptable that the ownership of such an important company was not clear. However, this situation had been maintained for so long that the entire Federation had started to accept it. In the eyes of the Federation government and many industry experts, The reason why the Shell Motor Company's shares were so scattered and complicated was because of historical reasons. It was a situation caused by the many big families and countless profit seekers. The Federation Statistics Department did the last calculation in the 41st year of the constitutional calendar and confirmed that if the Federation Citizen Fund and the shares with military background were included, the Federation could control 41% of the shares. The Statistics Department and the economists believed that under the strict supervision of the relevant laws, as many as 3,000 shareholders insider trading was completely blocked. It was difficult to fundamentally change the complex ownership structure formed by history. Under this situation, even if the Federation's 7 big families worked together, it was impossible to control the Shell Motor Company without alarming the Federation government. Note, it was precisely because of this reason that the no longer young President Nutshell now had a very shocked and wonderful expression on his face. After being voted by the federal parliament and personally appointed by the president, he had never thought that one day he would lose control of the board of directors. He looked at the shareholders who were attending the emergency board meeting, looked at the complicated but clear share confirmation on the screen in front of him, and looked at the few representatives of the Shu Foundation who were indifferent. He was speechless for a long time. Different from what the Statistics Department and the economists thought, the Thai family did not need to work with other big families to have enough shares to propose a private motion, and they could expressionlessly ask the government to return the Shell Motor Company. There is no insider trading because the thousands of unknown small funds and various associations were originally the Thai families. Since the beginning of the Republic, the bloodline of the previous dynasty had never given up on the control of the Shell Motor Company. The Thai family had only quietly dispersed the shares in their hands and distributed them to numerous newly established organizations. Then, with the most terrible erosion of time, thousands of small organizations quietly changed their names, and the Federation began to forget their existence. They hid in the Forgotten Kingdom, silently enjoying the huge dividends every year. Only when the family faced a fatal threat did these shares, which had disappeared for countless years, resurface. Mr. President, we respect your professionalism very much. I think the confirmation of the shares is very clear now. We have the certification of the 3 major accounting firms. If you continue to insist that the review needs more time, we will directly dismiss you according to the process. The representative of the Shu Foundation looked at the president of the Nutshell Foundation expressionlessly and said, "In fact, we all know very well why you are stalling for time, but I have to remind you that what we do is within the legal framework. Please don't bear the responsibility of the government that you shouldn't bear." The president frowned and asked, "I really want to know why you didn't hesitate to expose thousands of years of hidden shares to take back the Nutshell Motor Company. What is your purpose?" The lawyer walked out from behind and took out a few documents and spread them on the table. He said, very kindly, "According to the purchase contract and financial guarantee contract signed between the Shell Motor Company and the Federation government, 3 large amounts of money should have been received by now. We hope that the government can return the money immediately." The president of the Nutshell Foundation frowned even more. He was very clear about the current financial situation of the Federation government. It was already very difficult to support the Left Sky Starfield War. If it was in the past, the government could definitely delay the payment to the Nutshell Motor Company, but now the Thai family couldn't accept it. As for the only company that could continue to provide the government with war loans, the Sanlin United Bank, it was said that their new CEO had just been arrested by the government. The president's smile became bitter, and he asked, "What if the government doesn't return the money?" The lawyer suddenly changed his expression. He was cold and ruthless like a Bermuda loan shark. He slammed the table and roared, "It is only right to return the money owed. If the government doesn't return the money, all the production bases under the Nutshell Motor Company are not allowed to give them a single warship or mecha. The 4 feather-level warships that were preparing to leave the old moon base are to return immediately. The daily maintenance of the base is to stop immediately. Also, all the mechanical engineers that the company left in the army must be recalled. Don't forget that we are the ones paying their salaries. The president's body turned cold. He thought about the terrible situation that the Federation forces would face if all of this really happened. He couldn't help but clench his fists and shout, "Are you crazy?" The lawyer wasn't crazy because he was carrying out the will of Lady Tai. Facing the attack of the government, the madam's real crazy response was yet to come. If the voting rights in the parliament and the drastic change in the Nutshell Motor Company couldn't cause the Federation government to panic because of the limitation of time, then the following thing was completely different. Behind the New Moon base, in an important crystal mine area of the Ministry of Defense's General Assembly base, a violent explosion suddenly occurred. This explosion didn't cause too many casualties, but directly turned 455 units of crystal mines into green smoke. Crystal mines were very stable energy sources. Other than the abnormal transition of electrons caused by laser irradiation, they were as safe as a pile of rocks. This sudden explosion in the New Moon base was like a bolt of lightning that struck the hearts of many important people in the government and military. For the Federation forces in the war against the Empire, crystal mines were definitely the most important strategic resource. Without crystal mines, the Federation's fleet wouldn't be able to cross the vast universe. And no matter how strong the Federation's ground mecha troops were, they would only become a pile of steel garbage that looked at the left Sky Star region from the capital ring. 455 units of crystal mines turned into green smoke in the explosion. This wasn't a loss that couldn't be endured. But the problem was that if this explosion was deliberately caused by some power, then it meant that the other party had the ability to paralyze the Federation fleet at any time. The cold winter wind blew into the balcony and suddenly became warm, gently blowing the hair beside the wrinkles at the corner of the madam's eyes. She took the phone from Secretary Shun, smiled slightly, and replied, "Mr. President, Macho has been controlling the Crystal Mine Consortium in the back of the mountain for too many years. From exploration, mining, purification, preservation, and transportation, there are too many steps in this process. Even I don't know how many methods there are to turn these crystal mines into useless rocks or green smoke. When did you start preparing?" The madam slowly stood up, walked to the railing, and looked at the picturesque landscape covered by the winter snow. She gently breathed, then elegantly replied, "Maybe it started on the day the Empire ended. In the period of history that you and I are in, Macho started preparing these measures in the back of the mountain, starting from conversation on the balcony. Was that 3 or 4 years ago? At that time, sure, Qinghai killed several of your most important partners in the parliament." Su Lu returned from the West Woods to the capital ring, and you couldn't even shoot him down with your battleships. Then, General Li Jiedu came to Macho's back of the mountain and had a long talk with me. Lady Tai held the phone and said, "Mr. President, at that time I once said something. Once the steel monsters have their own consciousness, their appetite will become extremely greedy. In their eyes, any former overlord is just a few pieces of delicious synthetic meat. My family doesn't want to become the delicious synthetic meat in your eyes. So naturally, we have to make some preparations. You should allow the synthetic meat to have the right to fight back." With a muffled sound, a large caliber bullet with a tungsten tail shot out from the thick barrel of the ACW. It tore through the sky under the shadow of the lead clouds and blasted a terrifying deep crater in front of the military vehicle on the road. The distance was too far beyond the effective range. Sulu wasn't surprised that the first shot didn't hit the target. He carried the heavy military backpack and stepped on the smooth surface of the rock with one foot in front of the other. He aimed at the military vehicle on the road at the foot of the mountain expressionlessly and pulled the trigger again. Su Li's index finger quickly made contact with the trigger and then released it. The top half of the ACW kept retreating like a bolt of lightning and then bounced back. In the short span of 3 seconds, Su Lu, who was standing on the rock, fired 5 consecutive shots. Bang, 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 bang. The ground around the military vehicle at the foot of the mountain exploded almost at the same time. The rear tire of the military vehicle on the right was shot out and fell to the ground with a loud crack. Smoke and dust suddenly filled the road. As the strongest force in the Federation, the Iron 7 Division naturally had the fastest reaction speed. The moment the gunshots rang out, the two mechas of the defense battalion arrived with a roar. The tall and heavy bodies crushed the road, and thick mechanical legs stretched out like lightning and blocked the side of the dark green military vehicle. The seventh bullet came from the depths of the mountain range at high speed and hit the alloy armor of the MX mecha's mechanical legs. It actually shot out a dazzling white mark. Still, because of the distance, the ACW bullet couldn't penetrate the Federation's mecha. On the rock, Sulu was still expressionless. After changing the magazine, he aimed at the road at the foot of the mountain and continued to fire without stopping. In order to kill Du Shaoqing from a distance in front of the entire Iron 7 Division, there would only ever be a few chances or even just one shot. The problem was that because of the damn distance, Su Li's first shot had directly missed. Right now, he wasn't disappointed, just a little anxious. He didn't know what the lady behind Macho was doing, but he knew that she definitely had her reasons for wanting him to delay Du Shaoqing's movement into the city. So right now, his goal was no longer to kill Du Shaoqing, but to harass him. Otherwise, he wouldn't have chosen to shoot here. Of course, if the first 7 shots were lucky enough to hit the dark green military vehicle, that would be for the best. The sniping from the top of the mountain continued. The terrifying bullets created strange sparks on the mechanical legs of the two MX mechas that acted as a bulletproof barrier, making unpleasant muffled sounds. After the attack, the well-trained soldiers of the Iron 7 Division still maintained their valiant calm and silence. The team that stretched for more than a dozen roads neatly stopped. The dozen or so MX mechas scattered in the wilderness near the mountain range had already rushed toward the mountain peak. Long-range sniping. The shooting distance is already more than 4 kilometers. A staff officer crouched beside the dark green military vehicle and reported to the people inside. The Federation's standard sniper rifle doesn't have such a long range. Have you compared the sniper rifle of Chengdu Sanatorium? Yes, that sniper rifle doesn't have the same range. The door of the dark green military vehicle was suddenly pushed open. Du Shaoqing, who was dressed in a well-ironed general uniform, walked to the side of the mechanical leg. He looked at the dim light that was like a cigarette but on a mountaintop and listened to the muffled gunshots in front of him. It's the ACW. He took off his sunglasses and put them in the pocket of his military uniform. Then he reached his right hand to his side and took the heavy sniper rifle. With impeccable standard military movements, he aimed the flat end of the rifle at the mountain peak and pulled the trigger. Note: see Chapter 88 of the Bell in the Upper Forest in Volume 2. Where there's metal, there's a nutshell. Part of the shyness is because the first 300 to 400 words of this chapter are copied from that chapter. Part of the smugness is because the distribution of shares in the nutshell has to be clearly written, but I found that no matter how I write it, I can't write it better than I did 2 years ago. Part of the smugness is because the extra words in this chapter are enough to make up for the 300 to 400 words, so you can't accuse me of being unkind. Part of the smugness is because you know the reason. I've been hiding the beautiful inheritance of the Tai family's crown prince for as long as the shares in the nutshell. 2 years ago, I spent so many words explaining the shares in the nutshell. Who was the one who said I was spouting nonsense? Horizontal. Chapter 971. Bang! A loud and clear sound rang out. An extremely deep crack appeared on the boulder under Su Li's feet. The crack exploded in the middle, followed by a barrage of bullets. Not far away, a large tree was hit. The trunk swayed, branches and leaves fell, and the sharp white pieces of rock that were hit flew in all directions. The most dangerous bullet hit the top of the boulder, less than 30 centimeters away from the tip of his foot. Even though he was wearing thick military boots, he still felt his calf go numb from the impact. At this time, Su Lu suddenly felt a tingling numbness in his mind. He was so far away, yet he was still almost hit. He was startled and subconsciously took 2 steps back nervously. His originally continuous and extremely rhythmic shooting was suddenly interrupted. The optical targeting device was aimed at the space between the two giant mechanical legs of the military vehicle on the highway. It vaguely captured the image of the general firing the gun. He instantly remembered that after Mr. Schur's death, the ACW had been left in the Iron 7th Division. Now, it was naturally in Du Xiaoqing's hands. Su Li's pupils suddenly shrank. He took a deep breath, stepped forward, and returned to his original position. He leveled the ACW and continued to shoot at the road below. There was no extra emotion on his face, only a sense of valiance hidden behind the calmness. Takashi Aoki, who was behind the boulder under his feet, was continuously hit by bullets. He didn't even blink as he steadily maintained his shooting posture and continuously pulled the trigger. This was the shooting of ACW against ACW, a battle of will against will. Schiller once said, "Some people, even if they have a divine gun in hand, will never become the god of guns." Note, the ACW was no doubt a divine gun. These two were the only long-range divine guns left in the Federation, and they fell into the hands of two extremely determined and calm men. Today, they met on the mountain road and began to blossom. Presumably, they didn't feel like they were covered in dust. In the darkness before dawn, Su Lu arrived at the mountain opposite the Iron 7th Division's base. He lowered his body temperature and slowed his heartbeat, waiting silently like a rock. Then, he would wake up because of the gunshots and because he was shot. His day began in such a violent manner. It was destined to leave behind many unforgettable scenes in his life. Perhaps the human brain had some sort of ability to foresee this kind of fate. So at the beginning of the day, when he stood on the cliff and shot at Du Xiaoqing on the road at the foot of the mountain, Su Lu thought of many people in the past and the words those people once said. When he pulled the trigger, he thought of Schiller's famous words. When he reloaded, he thought of the conversation he had with Commander Zhong in the West Woods' Red Chili Oil restaurant. The Tiger of the West Woods thought that Du Xiaoqing was very dangerous because of his calm fanaticism and because he had expressed a certain attitude in the First Military Academy. The Federation needed a stronger government to truly defeat the Federation. It was because of this judgment that he had suppressed Du Xiaoqing for an entire 10 years. Su Li knew that Du Xiaoqing was very dangerous because he was no longer the commander of the Iron 7th Division, but the most unshakable existence in the federal military. He was a godlike figure deeply loved by the people of the Federation. If this person was allowed to lead the Iron 7th Division into the capital, no one knew what would happen, so he wanted to kill him. At the very least, no one knew what Du Xiaoqing was thinking about that day. When this famous Federation general indifferently ignored the danger and fired at the mountaintop like an ordinary soldier, what did he think of Su Lu? What reason did he have to continue on this faintly tragic path? Where did his cold desire to kill Su Lu come from? Du Xiaoqing pulled the trigger. A bullet fiercely shot into the mound under the rock, exploding into a clump of yellow earth. Su Lu pulled the trigger. A bullet fiercely shot into the mechanical leg on the road, producing a crisp sound. At this moment, the two people on the mountaintop and the road, no matter who killed who, would be able to quickly return this suffocating world to its normal path. However, because the distance was too great, the bullets fired from the two thick ACW barrels made the world change color. Loud bangs rang out, but they were unable to accurately kill each other. It sounded more like two silent blacksmiths continuously hammering iron. However, even if they were hammering iron, the next hammer might be able to break the iron plate. In that case, no one could guarantee that the next bullet fired from the barrel would hit the other's body first. Amidst the flying shards of sharp rocks, the crisp bangs of bullets, and the dense shockwave of bullets, Su Lu and Du Xiaoqing coldly looked at each other from several kilometers away, unmoving like mountains. At this moment, this extremely rare exchange of long-range sniping had nothing to do with the quality and accuracy of the guns. The only thing left was luck. The two of them were gambling with their most valiant willpower and determination. They were gambling with each other's lives. On a mountain road 170 kilometers to the south, two men were silently shooting at each other from long range. In the western suburbs of the capital, on the balcony behind Macho Mountain, Lady Tai and President Pabre were still on the phone. Terminating the military supply contract and blowing up the crystal mine is using the lives of millions of innocent soldiers on the front lines to threaten the Federation. Do you not have a single bottom line? What exactly do you want to do? Lady Tai indifferently listened to the president's low and sharp reprimand. She replied, "Mr. President, keeping a promise is the most basic of morals. It is the bottom line of human interaction. The Crystal Mine Consortium, in nutshell, were the conditions given to us by the entire society when we gave up the imperial power. If the Federation had kept the promise from back then, the shares of the 3,000 families would not have surfaced. If the government did not have any ideas about the Crystal Mine Consortium, the crystal mine would naturally be safe. The problem now is that you and your government have treated my family crudely. You have underestimated the Tai family and forgotten what this noble family name represents. This family has ruled humanity for tens of thousands of years, and the other 6 families were the retainers of the Tai family. Therefore, the Tai family has the responsibility and obligation to protect their existence, except for the Zhong family in the Westwoods. Because the Zhong family was the first to betray the dynasty. They surrendered to the Republican forces in exchange for military power, and they have always thought that the Eastwoods incident was a purge plan by the Tai family and the Union Gang, but they have never reflected on it. That is because their shameless surrender made those so-called democratic sages realize that these families are not as unshakable as they thought. Mr. President, I will not make the same mistake as the ancestors of the Zhong family. I will not surrender. So I can tell you clearly that these families may be destroyed because of internal reasons, but they will definitely not fall because of external pressure. President Pabre, on the other side of the phone, was silent for a moment before he asked, "What exactly do you want?" "I want you to step down," Lady Tai replied concisely. "That's an impossible thing." President Pabre replied in a deep voice, "The situation has developed to this point. Even if you have a trump card that can shake the Federation, it is impossible to turn back the tide of history. I want to remind you, madam, that Tai Ziyuan has already promised to donate the Crystal Mine Consortium. The shares of Nutshell are exposed to the public. Even if you families force me to step down or even kill me, do you think that the Federation will still be controlled by the 7 families in the future? Our trump card has never been completely explained by anyone, including you." Lady Tai walked to the railing with the phone in her hand. She looked at the thin ice on the surface of the lake and said expressionlessly, "Without the crystal mine and Nutshell, do you think that the Tai family will not be able to survive in the Federation? I can remind you of one point, including the President's residence in Parliament Hill. These lands are all mine." She did not give the other side of the phone the time to digest the shock and said, "A Yuan once trusted and admired you a lot, but you do not know that under that thin body hides a magma-like fury and a terrifying learning ability. When he discovered that you had betrayed the ideals he believed in, the combination of the two was so powerful. All of the families have been silent for an entire 3 years. That is because I know that if the government and you are willing to abide by the rules, Yuan definitely has the ability to defeat you. But since the Federation government is not going to abide by the rules and tear away the cover of the law, then do not blame us old fellows for taking action. I have to admit that your trump card and strength have indeed caused the Federation to be greatly threatened. But madam, have you not thought about how the current situation will end if the government is not willing to compromise? At that time, you should be very clear about what kind of reaction the federal forces will have. Mr. President, if you start to go crazy, if Li Jiedu starts to go crazy, if most of the people in the government start to go crazy, then I will have no choice but to become a crazy woman." Lady Tai held the railing with her left hand and the phone with her right hand. She said in a deep voice, "Even if we die together, so what? Our descendants will continue to live, and you and your government will gradually be eroded in these ruins, and then become an insignificant line on the pillar of shame in history." Her voice suddenly became cold, and with an extremely rare sharp and cold tone, she said sternly, "If you dare to let Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7th Division take one step into the capital, then we will all be destroyed together. If you want to destroy the Tai family, then you must take the Federation down with you. Mr. Pabre, from 3 years ago, I knew that you couldn't win this war because you weren't clear-headed at all. You didn't know that you were actually fighting against the entire world alone, against a great history that you didn't know how great." On the other end of the phone, President Pabre was silent for a long time, and then his tired voice became stable and tough again. He slowly replied, "Madam, if this is your last condition, then let us and this rotten world be destroyed together." After the call ended, Lady Tai stood by the railing of the balcony, looking at the quiet lake in the forest in winter, and was silent for a long time. Secretary Shun, who was standing behind her, had a nervous expression because of the president's last sentence. "In your opinion, is Du Shaoqing crazy?" Lady Tai suddenly asked. Secretary Shun shook his head. "Very good. Pabre has already started to regret, but let's see how long he can hold on." Lady Tai lightly touched the cold stone railing, as if she was describing the old general on the chessboard, who was full of vicissitudes of life, hiding in the soldiers and never waking up again. Chapter 972. There was an old proverb in the Federation, which was called passing on the torch. Because too much time had passed, most of the people didn't know the meaning of these 4 words. But for the people of the big families, they knew very well that these 4 words represented the reason why the family could survive for thousands of generations, and represented the endless desire to live and multiply. In the past years, no matter how heavy a blow the 7 families suffered in the war with the rulers, and how much their strength suffered the most extreme damage, as long as the bloodlines still existed and the best of the descendants lived on, then there would be a day when they would be able to repeat their glory. In the apartment building that had been turned into a silent military headquarters, the fully armed Blackhawk Security Company manager Shui, he looked at Tai Ziyuan in front of him and said, "Young master, look outside. I brought 400 of the most elite subordinates here, and the goal is to take you away, not to be persuaded by you to watch this civil rights movement." "I don't need to persuade you." Tai Ziyuan gently covered his mouth with a white silk handkerchief, looked at the solemn family forces outside the apartment building, and said with a smile, "The truth is that I don't want to leave, and you know very well that if I don't want to leave, you can't make me leave." "Young master," Shui anxiously said, "we are not the Li family, nor the Nan family. The Tai family only has you, and now that the government has shed all pretense of cordiality, Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7th Division will enter the capital soon. If something happens to you, the Tai family will be finished." Tai Ziyuan slowly put down the white silk handkerchief, pointed at the busy staff in the hall behind him, and said seriously, "The results of Parliament Hill will be out soon. 100,000, no, now more than 300,000 people are waiting in the streets of the capital for the final victory or the shadow of death. And these are all my responsibilities. How can I leave at this time?" "Responsibilities? Then what about your responsibilities to the family?" Shui looked at him with disappointment. "I don't think I have the obligation to take responsibility for the family." After a moment of silence, Tai Ziyuan gently patted Shui Yi's shoulder and gently replied, "Shui Yi, in my world, there is no concept of master and servant. Whether it is you, my mother, or that old man from the Li family who has already passed away, in fact, you have never understood what my true thoughts are." The young senator walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked at the sea of people that had already filled the streets not far away. He looked at the men, women, and children who were waving flags without knowing that danger was approaching. He said calmly, "In the battle against President Pabre, I more or less borrowed the strength of my family, but my purpose is still not the survival and glory of the 7 great families. My purpose is very simple. Whoever violates the charter and the laws of the Federation should pay the price." Tai Ziyuan turned around, pointed his right index finger at his pale face, and said with a smile, I'm really moved. Until today, I believe that whether it's Sue Lu, President Pabre, or you, none of you are willing to believe that I'm different from the elders of the family. I'm a newbie, a complete newbie. Don't try to knock me out and take me away. Otherwise, whether it's you or my mother, none of you can bear the possible consequences when I wake up. After saying this, Tai Yuan no longer continued to look at Shui Yi and those confused family members. He silently walked back to the command center hall, looked at the finance department manager who was still in a state of shock, and said with a smile, "I didn't expect that in my magnificent legacy there would be a part of the Nutshell Mobile. Please calculate with your colleagues in the finance department when you are free. If all the people of the Federation want to buy 11% of the shares of the Nutshell Mobile, how much would it cost per person on average?" Shui slowly put down the heavy standard machine in his hand and looked at the thin back of the desk in the distance with a complicated expression. As a core member of the Tai family for generations, for the first time, he was shaken by the concept of the so-called family of thousands of generations. Could it be that these things were really very boring like what the young master said? The homeland of the Federation was already in a precarious situation. Once this war really started, then no matter who won or lost, it would inevitably lead to the most tragic and terrifying ending. However, it seemed that the Creator wanted the people of the Federation to experience more tests and wanted the people of the Federation to know what was the true meaning of internal and external troubles. Therefore, more stories happened in the Zhuotian galaxy, which was far away from their homeland. Your Highness, the Crown Prince is now lost in the Federation, and the young princess is also staging an uprising in the Westwoods. If we launch such a large-scale attack on the Federation's war zone at this time, I am very worried that their situation will become more dangerous. The Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Military Affairs who received His Majesty's order looked at Huai Chaoshi, who was walking out of the camp in fear. His body was extremely low, and his voice was constantly trembling. It is his own choice to risk his life for those outlanders. Since that is the case, he must bear the consequences of this choice. Huai Chaoshi did not turn around. Her voice was abnormally calm. The Empire will not give up such a good opportunity in front of us just because of his life and death. The invasion force of the Federation is currently in a state of panic. Logistical support is rare and inefficient. If we lose this opportunity, have you ever thought about how many soldiers will die because of this when we want to take back planet Emohua and chase the invaders out of the Zhuotian galaxy in the future? Huai Chaoshi narrowed her eyes slightly and looked at the hundreds of Empire fighter jets whistling through the sky. She looked at the densely packed Wolf Fong mechas in the wilderness. She looked at the equipped military vehicles passing through the simple roads. She looked at the ordinary soldiers of the Empire who were holding guns and silent and uneasy. She said expressionlessly, "I am an older sister, but I am first and foremost the Empire's princess. I'm the highest commander of the Empire's frontline troops. I have to be responsible for these fresh faces living in front of me." After saying this invincible princess took off her black military cloak and threw it to Paul behind her. She then jumped onto the tall peach miasma mecha. Before Du Shaoqing left the Zhuotian galaxy, he had left her an extremely valuable gift. The Federal forces had obtained 2 great victories in Planet Emohua Strait's war zone and the Southwest war zone. All military analysts firmly believed that the Empire's ground forces, which had suffered heavy casualties and lacked the protection of a fleet, would not be able to carry out a large-scale attack for at least 2 years. The front line should be peaceful for a long time. However, out of the Federation's and even the entire universe's judgment, on the day the Federation's parliament began to impeach the president, the Empire's military launched an unprecedentedly fierce attack on the Federation. Furthermore, the strategic attack range this time had even exceeded planet Emohua and spread to several other war zones in the universe. The Empire's military, which had been lying low for several months, suddenly burst out and used the last of the Empire's fleet. The Imperial family even used ruthless means to directly conscript all the smuggled spaceships in Galaxy L. Faced with thousands of Empire's civilian-armed spaceships that covered the sky and covered the Earth and were not afraid of death, the Federal fleet, which was hovering on one side of the Zwetian galaxy, watched as their energy supply rapidly decreased. However, they did not obtain an overwhelming advantage. They could only passively leave the main war zones and watch as the ground forces fell into a fierce battle with the Empire's army. The Empire's ground forces fiercely pushed forward on several planets. Their commanders did not seem to care at all whether it was soldiers or mud that fell under the Federation mecha, nor did they care whether there were still allies in the area covered by the bombardment of the cluster formation bases. They only cared about advancing, advancing, and advancing. The battle on planet Mo was the most intense. The surface forces led by the three Empire's Royal Mecha Brigades successfully drove the Federal forces out of the Straits War Zone and the Southwest War Zone after paying a heavy price of 400 Wolf Fong Mecha being destroyed. Faced with this kind of almost berserk method of advancement, the Federation's Lieutenant General Hu Lian, who was known for his iron chain defense, was bitterly disappointed before the battle even started. Meanwhile, the Empire's commander Huai Chaoshi made a few extremely small mistakes in the Federation's command, and all of them were caught by the Empire's commander-in-chief, Huai Chaoshi, and then dealt the most accurate and fatal blow. The Federation's ground forces on planet Mo were forced to retreat under the powerful attacks of the Empire's army. In the few war zones that were separated, some of the troops were even forced to move to the dangerous mountainous areas and began a bleak long-term campaign. In this battle, Her Royal Highness the Princess, whose name shook the universe with her unparalleled strength in mecha warfare, finally proved that she also had the same genius ability in battlefield command. If it wasn't for the new 17th Division and Madman Li in the Beheading Happiness mecha, who fought almost crazily in a bloody battle and held back the two Empire's Royal Mecha Brigades on the northwest front line, perhaps in less than 24 hours, Huai Chaoshi and her subordinates would have already killed their way to the Federation's base. On this day, on the smoke-filled front line of planet Mo, who knew how many Federation soldiers were injured, how many Federation soldiers were sacrificed, and how many Empire officers who were gradually calming down silently thought, if the one commanding the Federal forces right now was still Du Shaoqing, would all of this have happened? The Federation's General Du Shaoqing, who was supposed to be commanding the Federal forces and fighting the Empire at the front line, was transferred back to the capital ring by the government due to some political reasons. Then, at this time, he became a silent, normal sniper, standing beside a military vehicle and continuously shooting at a certain someone on the mountaintop, as if his life was on the line. The crisp sound of metal striking rang out. The high-speed bullet hit the hard mecha's protective panel and bounced off, brushing past Iron 7 Division's commander Liu Yongfu's cheek and shattering the glass of the military vehicle. His pupils suddenly shrank, and he subconsciously wanted to find a place to hide, but looking at the back of the general in front of him, who was coldly aiming and shooting with a gun, he didn't dare to move his legs at all. The frontline battle report had already been sent back to the capital ring, and he looked at Du Shaoqing's back with a complicated expression, guessing what exactly was in his mind at this moment. On a mountaintop, Su Lu was holding his ACW and firing at the road below with an unusually calm expression. There was already a wound on the right side of his cheek caused by the shattered rocks, and blood was slowly flowing out of it. At this moment, he wasn't thinking about anything. From the corner of his eyes, he saw the Iron 7 Division's mecha approaching at high speed. He knew very well that in this situation, the more he thought, the faster he would die. Chapter 973. Even though there was a distance of several kilometers between them, the powerful tungsten alloy tail fins and large-caliber bullets still had terrifying kinetic energy. They easily drilled into the seemingly solid rock and rotated violently at high speed, blasting out countless sharp rocks and blinding dust. His left cheek was cut by a piece of rock. His blood and sweat mixed with the dust to form a colorless dye. Together with the sport's windbreaker full of holes, he looked exceptionally pitiful. The mixture of blood and sweat flowed into the corner of his eyes, piercing his eyes slightly. He subconsciously opened fire with the ACW in his hand. Looking at the military vehicle in the distance beside the road, a clear bullet point was only a little bit away from Du Shaoqing. Sulu couldn't help but curse under his breath, lamenting his luck and his misfortune. The slight numbness from his military boots made him realize that at this moment, whether he wanted to or not, if he didn't retreat in time, only death would await him. The two ACWs on the mountaintop and the road fired more than 20 rounds at each other. The 10 MX mechas scattered at the foot of the mountain from Iron 7 Division were already close to the top of the rock. Su Lu was the engineer who understood the MX mecha the best in this universe. He knew that ever since the counterattack in the West Woods, the Federation had begun large-scale mecha battles. All the MX standard mechas had their long-range weapons removed. For example, the main cannon that was designed back then was only left with the Darlin's autocannon. During that period of time, he had calmly stood on the rock and played cool with Du Shaoqing. It was precisely because he had calculated that those Iron 7 Division mechas that seemed extremely close to him would not be able to threaten him. And now, those 10 MX mechas were close enough. The area at the top of the rock had entered the range of the mecha's firepower. He could faintly hear the buzzing sound of the mechas on the mountainside. It was not the sound of dual engines, but the sound of the Darlin's autocannon rotating at high speed. What was even more frightening was that the three black mechas charging at the very front were beginning to shake off their components and enter overclocking mode. The time left for Su Lu to react, if accurately calculated, was less than a second. With only 1 second left, Su Lu carried the heavy ACW and the heavy military backpack. With a grunt, he jumped down the cliff without hesitation. Almost at the same time as he leapt into the cliff, a dense rain of Darling's cannonballs ferociously bombarded the boulder, instantly chipping off an entire layer of the boulder. Sulu landed heavily on a pine tree in the middle of the white stone cliff. Just when the pine tree couldn't withstand the huge force and made a cracking sound, his body bounced up at high speed again like a spring. His empty left arm stretched out in the air as he grabbed onto a protruding rock in front of him. His body swung in the air and disappeared into the corner of the cliff. This series of actions seemed easy, casual, and natural, but in reality, Sulu had performed extremely precise calculations beforehand to be able to use his inhuman abilities to succeed. Entering the corner of the rock wall, behind him was a deep valley that was no longer green and only yellow. Carrying a heavy military backpack, he quickly ran into the valley. The huge backpack seemed to want to cover his entire body. But the strange thing was, he didn't know why he always held the two guns horizontally. He would rather sacrifice some speed in running than carry them on his back or carry them with one hand. A moment later, the loud roar of engines tore through the mountain path that had just been quiet for a moment. 3 black mechas, already in overclocking mode, broke through the mountain rocks and gave chase with a ferocious momentum. Behind them, almost 10 mechas followed. At this time, Sulu had already charged about 300 meters into the valley like a flash of lightning. He suddenly stopped running at high speed. His military boots dug deep into the mud to dissolve the huge inertia. His body twisted under the support of terrifying strength and pulled the triggers at the 3 black mechas behind him. Pa! Pa! Not conforming to the norms of any military tactics manual, and beyond the imagination of the strongest warrior, Sulu, who was being chased by the mechas, actually had the time to turn around and fire 2 shots at lightning speed. This was why after leaving the cliff, he would rather sacrifice running speed to maintain the posture of holding his pistols with both hands. It was because he needed to ensure the speed of his shots. At such a close distance, the Federation's Gun King, ACW, definitely had the ability to shoot through the sturdy alloy plates of the mechas. The 3 black MX mechas behind him obviously knew this. At this time, these excellent pilots of the Iron 7th Division also displayed their excellent control skills. None of the three black mechas made any movement to slow down or evade. Instead, they suddenly crossed their fists in front of their chests and used their thick mechanical arms to protect the cockpit. The two armor-piercing bullets that Sulu had been preparing for a long time hit the mechanical arm of the black mecha at the front. Two sparks flashed, and the black mecha's mechanical arm emitted green smoke. However, the mecha itself did not suffer any damage. Its speed did not even decrease in the slightest. The black mecha crossed its fists in front of its chest. Its movements seemed clumsy and even a little comical, but it was actually very effective against the terrifying ACW. This was the most powerful tactic of the Iron 7th Division. Sulu was still running with his head down. The three Iron 7th Division mechas were still in pursuit. In just a few seconds, they had covered hundreds of meters again. However, no matter how strong the human body was, it could not compare to the energy of the quantum beam jet of the twin engines. The distance between the two sides was getting closer and closer. Just as it seemed that he was about to enter a desperate situation, Sulu burst out again. However, this time, he did not use the powerful strength of his legs to stop his forward momentum. Instead, he stomped on the ground with his military boots. His entire body flew up, and he completed a twisting motion in midair. He flew smoothly backwards like a bird in the winter valley, his body balance perfectly maintained. He leveled his ACW and looked expressionlessly at the nearest Iron 7th Division mecha. Pa! 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 3 shots. The 3 bullets avoided the clumsy mechanical arm of the Iron 7th Division mecha in front of the cockpit. They seemed to be unintentional, but in fact they accurately hit the hidden guard behind the mecha's shoulder blade. In the minds of most Federation pilots, the hidden guard with 6 screws was like the cecum of a human's abdomen. It was completely useless. However, in the eyes of a certain person who designed MX, the hidden guard was like the skull of a human head. Below it were densely packed data cables. Once they were opened in his hands, he would be able to directly control the mecha. I'll kill you in 3 shots. Look at that perfect angle, that precise wedging force. Sulu muttered to himself as he breathed heavily. He ran up the steep hill. From the corner of his eyes, he glanced behind him from time to time. He found that the 10 or so Iron 7th Division mechas behind him had not yet closed in. Because of the terrain, the 3 black MX mechas at the front were gradually pulling away from him. The black MX that he had hit 5 times in a row was the closest to him. It was also the most aggressive. However, in Suli's eyes, this black MX was like a delicious piece of cake. He held his ACW and breathed rapidly, silently chanting in his mind. Closer, a little closer. Those behind, slow down a little. It was truly a pipe dream for him to think that he could defeat Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7 Masters with just 1 person or 7 teams to fight against the federal government. However, for him, if he had a powerful mecha, perhaps the situation would be fundamentally changed. After the battle 3 years ago, the Federation government began to strictly control the use of military mechas. They were protected by multiple layers of passwords. When they were not activated, even Sulu would not be able to successfully steal them. Today's scene was the result of Suli's calculations. He knew that the mecha group of Iron 7th Division would definitely catch up, and this would be the best chance for him to steal the mecha. Stealing a military mecha with his bare hands. In the eyes of many people, this was akin to a myth. No one will believe it, but Sulu had seen Uncle Feng go crazy before. In fact, he had even played out a similar scene on Mo Hua planet. Today, Sulu did not have an engineering mecha, nor did he have a miniature repair arm. However, he had his ACW. Seemingly unintentionally, he had been shooting at the hidden guard all this time. His goal was to force the guard open and then find a chance to flip over and use the data under the guard to directly take control of the Black MX. Once he got his hands on the mecha, it would be Du Shaoqing and the Iron 7th Division's turn to fret. Du Shaoqing watched as the blurry figure disappeared over the side of the cliff. He watched as the 10 or so mecha chased after it. Expressionlessly, he took back his ACW and handed it to the officer beside him. Then, he picked up his sunglasses and gently blew off the dust on the lenses before putting them on and walking towards the military vehicle. Suddenly, his sword-like eyebrows shot up. He abruptly turned around to look at the rocky peak that was now nowhere to be seen. He remembered the battle report Li Feng had sent back from Mo Hua Planet a few days ago, and remembered the MX mecha that Su Lu had successfully captured. His raised eyebrows suddenly sank. Du Xiaoqing said in a low voice, "Withdraw all mecha." Including Division Commander Lu Yongfu and all the staff officers, no one understood why the division's mecha had to withdraw just as they were about to catch up and eliminate that damn sniper. However, the discipline of the Iron 7th Division was as strict as a mountain. Facing this division commander Xiaoqing, who was no longer a division commander, everyone was used to following orders without questioning or questioning. The order for the mecha group to withdraw immediately reached the mountain valley in the shortest amount of time possible. Du Xiaoqing stared silently in the direction of the deep mountain valley through his sunglasses, and then ordered, "Troops continue forward. Target is the 1st Unified Special District." The surrounding Iron 7th Division officers were slightly taken aback. Then, some of them understood Division Commander Xiaoqing's meaning. As long as the troops did not disperse and used several mecha to seal off the shooting angles in the direction of the mountain range, what could the sniper in the mountain do? The other party could only watch as this flood of steel silently and unstoppably entered the capital special district. There was nothing they could do. This was Du Xiaoqing. This was the Iron 7th Division. This division and its core figure sometimes looked a little too mechanical and cold, but they yearned for victory but were not greedy for it. Their eyes were clear, their steps firm. They may not be the strongest division, but they were definitely the division that made the least number of mistakes. Du Xiaoqing sat back in the car with an expressionless face. He didn't look at the handcuffed officer beside him. He slowly undid the top button of the general's uniform, dissipating the heat in his body. Then, he silently thought of the previous moment. Why did he inexplicably hold an ACW and shoot at Su Lu? If this had happened on the battlefield, this would have been an absolutely unforgivable mistake. He, who was known to never make mistakes, slowly frowned, feeling very puzzled. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.